I am curious, how have you all enjoyed your time the past 3 or 4 days? Great, okay. So what have you enjoyed while being here? Not walking? What else? Reconnecting, okay. What'd you say? Meeting people in person, agreed. Hugs? What else have you guys enjoyed? The information, all right. Anybody in the back, have you enjoyed anything? Anybody? I can't hear you. Nobody enjoyed anything in the back. All right, we got to get some surveys to the back of the room. All right, I have enjoyed my steps. I think I had 35,000 steps because I had no choice. They're like, yeah, you're in building 1. I'm like, but building 1 looks like it's in building 3. So my walk has been very extreme. So I'm very excited. It's our 3rd day here. We have 3 great speakers this morning. We'll end this morning on a town hall panel discussion. I'll be moderating that. But I'm excited to go ahead and introduce our first speaker this morning, who is Regina Phelps. She's awesome. So first of all, let me say, when her session is over, she'll be outside. She has quite a few books that she has published, and so you guys will be able to talk to her there. But for those of you who don't know, Regina Phelps is an internationally recognized thought leader and expert in the field of crisis management, pandemic and continuity planning and exercise design. She is the founder of EMS Solutions. And since 1982, EMSS has provided consultation and speaking services to clients in 5 continents. She is the author of 4 books. All of them are available on Amazon. However, I got a short plug. So this is titled, What If Your Defenses Fail? Cyber Breach, Designing an Exercise to Map a Ready Strategy. So what's going on in the news right now? What'd you say? Cyber. There's a whole lot going on in the news. War, but cyber is real. So the President of the United States has made that very clear, and as corporations, as business continuity professionals, we have a job to do when we leave this conference. So please help me introduce and welcome Regina Phelps to the stage, and she's going to be speaking with us.
Oh, Vanessa, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, DRJ. I think I've spoken at every DRJ since 1997. And it's so nice to actually be in person with so many folks. So it's great to see you all. So here we are today talking about, let me back up here. What we're here today to talk about is, of course, leadership at time of crisis. Wow. You know, how many things could you possibly have going on at one particular time? So my subtitle of this speech is Crisis Management in Really, Really, Really Tough Times. And I wrote this speech about, 5 or 6 weeks ago. We know that was before the Ukraine war, before the increased cyber threats that we're experiencing. And in my 40 years of practice, I never once in my life actually believed I'd be asked by clients to actually do planning for nuclear wars, civil wars in the United States, and really amazingly challenging things happening all at once. So we really are in really challenging times. So in my core specialty, I focus my work on 3 things. I do crisis management development for corporations and large companies. I work with many executives to help them build programs. I'm a pandemic planner, which is, I guess, fortunate in a pandemic. and of course, I design about 100 big exercises a year. So that's my area. Now, I would be remiss to just talk through my deck with you without, first of all, talking about the war in, about the war in Ukraine. Because we are watching and witnessing crisis leadership that is phenomenal in my mind when I think about President Vladimir Zelensky. So let me just talk a little bit about this guy. Now, this particular person is always introduced and talked about as being a comedic person, but also an actor. But he's actually a lot more than that. So he was actually born in the central part of Ukraine At that time, Ukraine was a Russian part of the Soviet Union, so he's a native Russian speaker. He went to law school, graduated, but he never practiced. He had a real knack for acting and for being a comedian. So he actually then moved to Russia and started a media company. And he produced lots of different programs, but he also became very well known for something called Servant of the People, which was a comedy of which he played a school teacher, and he had a viral riff one day, and he became like this sensation and was elected president of Ukraine. Oh my gosh. Then what happened is that in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, he actually gave a large amount of money. He was living in Moscow, that's where his company was. He gave a large amount of money to the Ukraine military to fight Russia. Okay, that wasn't really popular in Russia. And Putin said, you know, you need to like change your attitude or, you know, do something else. And so he took his entire company and moved it to Ukraine in 2014. In 2018, his staff thought he had really good political savvy. And before he knew it, they actually started a party in Ukraine called Servant to the People, named after his television show that was wildly popular. And he ran in 2019 and won 72% of the vote. He then became known to the American people by an event that occurred when President Trump and he were on a phone call that led to President Trump's first impeachment. And that's when he actually was trying to convince him that he should actually give him dirt on Joe Biden. So that's how we learned about him. And then here we are now with him actually being probably one of the most amazing leaders that one could imagine. And what I want to talk about is the master class that Vladimir Zelensky is doing every single day. How many of you are following the war? Yeah. So he actually is really giving a master class of what I would call, if I was going to grade a crisis management person, I would give him the highest marks of anybody I've ever seen under pressure. And let me just talk about a couple of things. First of all, he speaks in the language of the people. What do I mean by that? Almost every day on Telegram and other different social media platforms that are still available in Russia, he delivers a small, 3-4 minute address to people in Russian that's distributed in Russia, specifically targeting them about what's happening in Ukraine. He is actually brilliant, and his language and his style of presenting these short little vignettes is brilliant. He has incredible empathetic leadership. He is actually communicating so clearly and with so much empathy that it's so easy for all of us to connect with him. He actually is fighting for what he believes in. He says he's about the land and he's about freedom. And he is showing that, as are all of the Ukrainians. He actually is also not abandoning his people. He is one of those leaders who says, I'm willing to die for my cause. And he actually means it. That in itself is impressive in its own right. And then lastly, the thing that I think is really the most amazing thing about him is he is positive and uplifting and optimistic in some of the most awful conditions. And he has inspired leaders around the world. I've actually heard several of his addresses to different bodies around the world, like when he addressed Congress in the United States. He's addressed the UK, he's addressed the European Union, and he always ties in this amazing speech about what happened in that country and then parlaying it back to actually what's going on in the Ukraine. An amazing piece of leadership. He will be forever known for this one statement: the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. Biden offered to airlift him and his family outside of Ukraine when the invasion started, and that was his response to President Biden. And he has stayed there the entire time. So, let me talk about what my roadmap is. what I'd like to be talking about with you is I want to talk about essentially what was the last 2 years has been like. Oh my gosh. I want to talk about your brain in crisis. It's kind of scary. I also want to talk about leadership learnings from this COVID-19 pandemic. And then we're going to talk about something called emotional intelligence or emotional quota. And then we're going to talk about ways that you can develop your own EI. So on that note, what about the last 2 years? How's it been for you? Pretty tough, huh? Brutal. So I've done this work for a long time, and I've done pandemic planning since 1997. Never in my life did I imagine what it would be like to live in a pandemic for 2 years, let alone actually have to work in it. So I have felt all of these emotions nonstop for 2 years. I have been angry, I've been frustrated, I've been sad, I've been depressed, I've been happy, I've been exhilarated, I have been all of those things. And sometimes I'm actually all of those things at the same time, which is very confusing. Anybody have those things going on? Yeah, amen, right? Oh, Lord. So it's been tough. And I think the thing that's really difficult about all of this is that because it's still going on, we're still experiencing this, we don't know what's going to happen next, these feelings are still probably under the surface for all of us, which probably leads to some of the kind of not the best behavior we've seen in people over the last couple of years. So I've been a pandemic planner since 1997. What got me interested in that? I'm one of those weird people that are deeply curious about all kinds of things. And so I was actually doing a speech in Toronto at the World Conference on Disaster Management. And I heard this speaker, it was the physician in charge of the medical system in Canada, talk about the 1918 flu. Okay, my background's in nursing. I had never heard of the 1918 flu. And it was actually interesting. Prior to the avian outbreak in the 2000s, people just didn't understand or know about that. And a lot of that was because of its suppression during World War I. So anyway, I came back to the United States, and I told my staff, I said, oh my gosh, this is so cool. We have to learn everything about pandemics because we're going to start doing pandemic plans. And my staff was like, okay. So, back then, there was no real good Google sources. The internet was just sort of really popping up. So it meant like phone calls and sending letters, oh my gosh, to CDC and WHO and all of that. So we figured out how to do a pandemic plan, and we started doing those in 1997. So fast forward to 2020, actually 2019. One of the things I would encourage you to follow if you're interested in diseases, there's a great site called promedmail.org. It's an infectious disease site that's monitored and produced by Harvard. I've been following it since 1997. So every day they send me all these really creepy things about diseases that are happening all over the world. Oh, it's so much fun. And so I look at it every day. On December 31st, 2019, I happened to notice the post that day. Respiratory illness in Wuhan, China, large number of infections. And I said to myself, oh my God, is this it? I think about that with some frequency, but that one actually really made me think twice. So then, this appeared in Stat, which is a medical publication, but also a website. And this was on January 8th. WHO says mysterious illness caused by a new virus. And I thought, oh my God, this is it. So on January 8th, I sent an email to all my clients and said, okay, remember that pandemic plan we wrote? This is the time to pull it out and start thinking about this. They, of course, thought I was amusing, but that's what I did. So we have been supporting, personally, we've been supporting about 300 companies around the world since early January. So we've been in this for a long time. When I saw that post on January 8th, this is what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the 1918 flu and everything that went well and didn't go so well. And it has been quite the ride. Now, of course, once I was thinking about the 1918 flu, this is what happened. My reptilian brain kicked in. The reptilian brain is actually a major issue for many people. So what is the reptilian brain? It's your brain in a crisis. So your brain, just to give you a little bit of anatomy this morning, is actually composed of 3 parts. Essentially, we have the neocortex, which is the front, and that's the part that has to deal with thinking and talking and all of those things. Then we have actually our midbrain, which is where all your feelings and your memory is. But the reptilian brain, yes, that means it's the oldest part of your neurological system, is your fight or flight response. It's the one that gets a huge amount of cortisol into your blood and gets you really jacked up. And this is also problematic in any situation of stress. So that means that we are not necessarily always in our best shape because of this primitive brain that kicks in. And so that includes all of our leaders. And so sometimes we don't make the best decisions. So that's an important thing just for to know about yourself, but to know about leaders that you support, that when they're under a lot of stress and under a lot of crisis, you can actually be operating out of your reptilian brain. So how do you calm down this reptile that's in your skull? It's all by having good information. And that was incredibly challenging in the pandemic. Oh my gosh, I never even imagined all the years I've been in practice that we would have such misinformation. So what your job is, what my job is, if I'm supporting leaders or I'm actually doing crisis management myself or business continuity, is I need situational awareness. You can't make decisions if you don't have good situational awareness. But where do you find it? And that's been a huge problem. So our job is to get situational awareness, because when we have that, that allows us to understand the critical elements of the problem in front of us. But that means we need good information. So your job often in your position, I am guessing, is to do 2 things about situational awareness. First of all, is to literally collect the information. Find incredible sources to pull information in. But then once you've actually brought that in, then you've got to do something with it. So you have to process it. You have to make an assessment of it. You have to display it in ways that's meaningful for executives and individuals to make decisions. So situational awareness is critical, but most people never think about how am I going to process it? What am I going to do with it? How am I going to share it? Because it's like drinking out of a fire hose when you look at what went on with this pandemic. The source issue is the big problem. You know, the internet's not all filled with correct information. Have you noticed? Oh my gosh, I feel like everybody's got like an epidemiology degree from Facebook or something. It's like, it just makes me crazy. So this issue about sources is really, really important. And I find that people don't validate information. They see something in some feed, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is, and they go, oh, and they assume it's right, and then they pass it on to somebody else. So with my staff and myself, I say, if you look at anything on social media, minimally, you must look at 3 credible sources before you would ever, 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 ever consider that it's valid. Because often it is not, right? So these are significant challenges that we have had, which has been tough in keeping our reptilian brain in check. So first of all, when you're looking at evaluating that information and looking at situational awareness, look at your information sources. You want to research that they are valid. And what you want to do is you want to assess and validate information before you pass it on to your leadership. That takes a little bit of time. And people are not very comfortable in waiting, and that's also part of this problem. So where do you get your sources? You want to make sure that they are valid, that they are reliable, and you want to make sure that you are verifying, because people are making decisions based on the information that you are serving up to a crisis management team in particular. Where the United States and frankly most countries in the world have failed miserably in this pandemic is they have never been clear about the messaging about how science is iterative in nature. Now, most science we never personally witness as citizens. Most things go on for years before they are actually released. And so if you look at either drug information, if you look at disease information, it goes on for a really long time before it's ever pushed out. But because of the acute nature of the pandemic, it was critical that people actually got this information in a timely manner. So it looked messy because it was. And science takes time, and you try something, it doesn't work, you learn over time, and that's where it's been very confusing and really frustrating for the public, and the people who have been communicating it haven't done a great job. So when I work with crisis management teams, I look around a series of what I call rules. And when I look at what happened over the course of this pandemic, I'm looking at these rules as a way of judging how we have done. So let me just talk through these. These are what I call the basic 5 rules of crisis management. The first one is that a crisis requires the leader to actually accept responsibility for what's going on. The best leaders I work with are accountable. They are up in front. They are not standing behind. And so they are accountable and they are sharing the risk. I look for my best leaders, though, the clients that we have are always the person in front. The next thing I'm looking for is that for you to build confidence and for you to actually set direction in an organization, you need to make sure that they are making decisions. Now, the reason I kind of laugh about that is many of my clients are so reluctant to make a decision until they know everything, right? Anybody ever have that problem? No one's willing to make the decision. And so therefore what happens is that we drag our feet and we don't do anything. And if you make the wrong decision, what I say to my clients all the time is make another one. You need to keep moving the group forward. That is your job. And so we need to have leaders that are open and transparent, and we need to be able to ask questions. And if they made a decision that doesn't work out, they need to make the next one. The next thing is they have to be consistent. They have to be resilient, and they have to be in this for the long haul. A good example of that is again, President Zelensky in Ukraine. Standing the ground, being there for the consistent moment, being there and being present is absolutely critical. Ethics has to be central to all the decision making. There has to be an ethical core to what's happening, because that allows us to then build more trust with the person that we're working with. And then lastly, we will need to celebrate all the wins, and even more importantly, we need to mourn the losses. And a lot of leaders are good at the celebration part, but they're really uncomfortable with the losses. And if you look around the world, both in leaders of countries, but also in leaders of large companies, the best ones have really understood that in the pandemic. And they have celebrated the wins in those organizations and countries, and they have mourned all of the losses. And that's really essential. So that's what I looked at when I was actually evaluating what I saw in leadership around the world. So let's sort of begin to talk about the learnings that I've actually discovered over the course of studying this pandemic for the last 2 years. What I came up with is that the best leaders had heart. And those are 5 different skills that I'm really looking at that I think made the biggest difference in companies and governments around the world. The first one is humanity. In a disease where you can't see anything, you don't know whether somebody standing in front of you is infectious, you have no idea what's going to happen to you if you get sick, there's a huge amount of fear. And what you need is you need people that are human, that they actually have empathy. And the best leaders are the ones that can connect with people on a personal level and show that humanness. The next one is the issue of evolve, the power of the pivot. In my professional career, I would have never believed that so many things could pivot so rapidly in the pandemic. Absolutely amazing to me. The next one is action, that they had a process They had clear, delineated roles and responsibilities, a team that could actually allow them to move forward, and an actual process of crisis management that they had practiced and knew and they could actually execute on. Regard. They demonstrated caring for themselves, but for others. And in a disease, that's the most important thing you're looking for, is a caring leader. And then lastly, they issued timely communications, even with incomplete information, which made them really uncomfortable. They still put out what they needed to. I want to peel back all 5 of these skills. So the humanity thing I can't emphasize enough. In a disease where people are fearful, we don't know what's going on, you need leaders who have humanity front and center in who they are, and a huge amount of empathy. So what does that really mean? What you're looking for is somebody that's going to be as authentic as you can possibly have. Somebody who's going to just be real. And I started to see that pretty early in a zillion Zoom calls, at least I'm sure you saw them as well, where leaders all of a sudden didn't quite look all buttoned up like they used to. They were getting more casual. Their kids might be running in the background. There were dogs barking. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, that's a human over there, right? There was a humanity that we could connect with them and they could connect with us. And there was an empathy as well, where they actually were concerned about their employees and their families, and they talked about it. And many of my clients, the best ones in particular, did it with a lot of feeling. How important was that? The other thing is that they were candid. There were lots of things that we didn't know, and we still don't know everything, of course, but we did a lot of things at the beginning that were just frankly scary. And we didn't know anything. And they were really candid about what we knew and didn't. And they really had a strong ethical framework that they were operating out of. And that's what we need. Now, there were also a lot of personal things that I think made a really big difference. You know, once you've seen your boss, you know, in jogging clothes, or, you know, their kid spilling cereal all over their computer or whatever, all of a sudden, there's a big difference because we understand them from a human perspective. And you would have never, ever had that opportunity before. And you can't pack that back into a box. So we know people in a very different way. And I think, again, when you look at this empathy, what I really found in my clients is that if people were open and truthful and just empathetic and connected with the people, that their leadership was, bar none, the best. And so I hope that we keep this quality, because I think it makes the workplace a much better place overall. The issue of the power of the pivot, I think, is amazing. If anybody would have said, okay, Regina, we're going to have our entire company of some of our clients, 100,000 people, they're all going to go home and start working next week on Monday, and oh, by the way, we haven't figured out how we're going to do that, and it's Friday. Wow. If I would have ever said that to anybody that we're going to do that, they would have locked me up. So when you think about what it took to make the decision, to then get your IT folks on it, and then send all those people home when we had really no idea how it was going to work, was a miracle. If I would have ever asked somebody that say, okay, let's do this, they would have thought I was nuts. And yet, most of my clients still have less than 10% of their people back at work. And there's a whole other speech I could do to talk about what's going to happen in the workplace, but I don't have time for that today. But things are going to be different. There's no way you can pack it back in the box, both in what's happened to the world in general, to the workplace, but we can't go back to how it was. It'll be different. And many of my clients are really struggling to figure out what that means. But this ability to be creative and to adapt has been miraculous to watch. And I think you should really pat yourself on the back because many of you in this room were key for all of that. And that's something that we need to remember. Action. So the issue related to having teams, processes, procedures, training, exercises. So I always say to somebody, there's 3 things you've got to have when you have a crisis management team. Only 3. You have to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities at all levels of the organization, from the mothership headquarters all the way down to a sales office down here. And there has to be clear identification of who is doing what. We all have to know that. So roles and responsibilities all the way through an organization. Secondly, you need to have a process where you assess an incident, and there needs to be designated individuals who have the responsibility and the authority to activate a plan. And the third thing is you have to be able to develop an action plan. Those are the only 3 things. Now, I will tell you that half the people at high risk have maybe 1 out of 3. It's really an important issue. My clients who had a really effective crisis management process really did well very quickly. And that's because that they had practiced their plans, they had processes in place, everybody knew what their job was, and we weren't struggling trying to figure out who's doing what. So having that in place is absolutely essential. And as you go back and do an after-action report on your response in the pandemic, really look at how that works in your organization. The regard for others in a disease, an event caused by a disease, having a lot of regard for others is absolutely essential. And so what you want to be thinking about is you want to be thinking about, again, I looked for people who were supporting their folks, providing them exactly what they needed. If they needed, looking at how their work schedule was, balancing their kids, maybe they were working in the evening instead of the day, maybe they worked on the weekends instead of parts of the weekday. Whatever it did to be able to make them be able to be successful in this new life that we were living in our hybrid world. The other things about looking at making sure that we weren't overburdening people and that we were also really making sure that they had the mental health support that we need. The long tail of COVID, there are many long tails of COVID, but one of the ones that's going to be with us for an extended period of time is the mental health of this country, as well as the mental health of much of the world, which has been forever changed. There's been some really recent and interesting studies about what's happened in people's brains, not from being sick from COVID, but the stress of the last 2 years. That will not go away quickly nor easily. So that's a long tail issue that we're going to be dealing with. And so the other issues about, again, burnout, people are already fried. I've been talking to my clients about burnout forever. And it's been so frustrating because the biggest failure my clients have done is they have not done enough rest for themselves. They basically worked 7 days a week, week after week after week, and they burn themselves to a crisp. It's hard to come back from that. That's where you want to make sure that if you have a primary and a secondary and a tertiary person in your crisis management team, that other people are called up to do the work. Even though, yes, I know you're important, but you're not that important. And if you are, that's a problem. The last thing is timely communications. Most corporations don't want to communicate things until they know everything. And so that was a huge stretch in the pandemic because we still don't know everything. And so I think the issue, communicate what you know. Communicate through all of your usual methodologies. You need to have a clear and consistent message. If you communicate something and it turns out now to be different or wrong, then say something else. But being silent is not helpful in this kind of pandemic. We need to make sure that we are acknowledging the situation, that we're expressing some emotions and feelings through all of this. This is what makes a great leader, is a timely, empathetic, connected communication. That's what we're looking for in this whole process. So those are the 5 things that I think made the best leaders in this pandemic, all under the acronym of HEART. But what it gets to even more in a central core is something that's called emotional intelligence. Because all of the 5 things I mentioned are wrapped around this concept of emotional intelligence, which might be something that you've heard about before. So when you look at what a successful leader is, if you ask most people what a successful leader is, they're very likely not going to say something like empathy or emotional intelligence. What's very commonly attributed to a great leader is, boy, they're intelligent, they're decisive, they're strong, they're powerful, you know, they have a lot of energy, they have vision, blah, blah, blah. And if you go to any MBA school, that's what people most commonly think. But what turns out is that when you study effective leaders, that's not what their skill set is. Their skill set is very much about 1/3 of their success is because of their experience and or their education, and about 2/3 of it is because of their emotional intelligence. That's been studied at Harvard, at Stanford, and many universities, and it's been replicated over and over again. It's the emotional intelligence that makes the leader great. So, what's the connection between strong emotional intelligence and leadership? It's actually empathy, which you wouldn't necessarily think was on the top list of a successful leader. So, what is emotional intelligence? Has anybody heard of it before? Yeah, right? 1995, a really salient piece of work by Daniel Goleman was called Emotional Intelligence, and it was what makes a leader great. This has been studied a zillion times, and it's been kind of the Bible of many folks, not always following it, but it is a really important piece of work, and it's been around for a very long period of time. Essentially, what emotional intelligence talks about is it talks about you, and it talks about your response with others. So when it talks about you, me, in this case, I'll talk about me, it means that I understand what I am feeling. I understand how my emotions affect other people, and I also have abilities and skills to manage my own emotional stuff. But that also means that it's not just about me, it's also about what I understand about others. And so the best leader understands when they walk into a room that they need to be very clear about what the emotions are of the people in the room and really try to understand where they're coming from. That's really all emotional intelligence is about. It essentially, again, is comprised of these sort of 4 boxes, if you will, and I'm going to talk through each one of these. The first 2 at the top, which is self-awareness and self-management, that essentially is your personal competencies, what you personally bring to the party. And then at the bottom is the actual social competencies, which means your ability to intuit, if you will, the people in the room. So your ability to be socially aware, but also your ability to relationship manage these folks. That's what you're looking for in a really good leader. So let me talk about this for a moment. I want you to be thinking about yourself and also to think about other leaders that you know. So for your personal competencies, your self-awareness, do you have a sense of how you are feeling at the moment? Now, we've all been in situations where you walk into a room and the leader is really preoccupied. Maybe they're running a meeting, but they're really not present. We all know that. We know what it's like when the person who's leading is either frustrated or has many other things going on. They're not present, they're not with us, and they're not really effective. How do you show up when you actually are engaging with other people? What are the triggers that you might have? This is about you being aware about you. And how critical, I mean, there's such a difference if you're running a meeting with somebody who actually is paying attention to what's going on with themselves versus being just, kind of self-absorbed and still trying to be in this space. The most important part of this is really you understanding and knowing yourself. The best leaders know that. And if they're off, they're going to do the next part of this, which is to be more aware and actually manage themselves. So when you decide you're going to be in a meeting or you're going to run an event or you're in the middle of a crisis, you need to stop and do some self-reflection. Get yourself grounded about what's going on. Because if you aren't grounded, you are not going to be effective and you're not going to be a very good leader in this process. So that means that if you first of all check in with yourself, then you find like, oh, I'm out of sorts, right? You know, things aren't right. Then what do? You need to have some skills so that when you check in, like I'm off base. Has anybody ever been off base in a meeting? Right? You're preoccupied, you got a lot going on, you're not really present, right? So how do you get yourself kind of organized, right? So this is about self-management. This means that you know what your own personal triggers are, and you've got a kind of a list of self-management techniques. So for me, one of the things is that I do best. If I'm really frustrated, the thing I need to do is I need just to stop what I'm doing and the best thing for me is to go out and take a 10-minute walk. Go outside, walk really fast, come back, and I am like, okay, yeah, that was good. I'm here. If I don't do that, then what I am is I'm just sort of stuck. Now, I can still run a meeting, I can still do all that stuff, but was I my best? No. Did I actually deliver as good as I could have? No. Knowing yourself is really important, and things that would help you improve is the second part of that. That allows you to show up for whatever you're trying to do and really be the way you want to be. So, that's you. But what about other people? Okay, social competencies. Social awareness. Have you ever been in a conversation with anybody and you had this experience? Cellular mobile devices that are the biggest distractor of all time are a huge impediment to you and your ability to interact with your colleagues, run a meeting, do anything. There have been studies that even if your mobile device is sitting on the table and you are not looking at it, what does that tell the person that you're sitting with? You're not that important. Because you know what's important? That little piece of plastic that's sitting on my desk. So you have to really be aware of that kind of social awareness issue. So it's really important that if you're in a conversation with somebody, that you are actually in the conversation. That means that you are paying attention, that you're listening, and that you're really checking in with yourself. Leaders who understand this, that have social awareness, have far more effective relationships and are much better at leading. This allows you also to be aware of them out here, but also yourself. Because it's kind of a two-way street that you have going on here. And once you are more aware of what is happening to the people you're talking to, the better you can respond. And then that gets into this issue of relationship management. Now, one of the things that I have a tendency to do is that when I come into a room, there's this concept called, intuiting the room. What's the energy of the room? Okay, I'm from California, I can say, ooh, what's the energy of the room? But the idea of like, what's going on out there? Now, when you walk into a room, can you feel if people are angry or frustrated? Right? You can feel if they're present and they're kind of ready to go. If you walk into a room and you feel like, wow, something's not right. Now, some leaders will just power on. Okay, here we go. We're walking through this agenda. Somebody who is self-aware, who has a lot of emotional intelligence, would say, something seems a little off today. Is something going on that we need to talk about? Just having that quick, like, oh, I recognize that something's not right. And sometimes there can be a short conversation, and then people can kind of regroup, and you can continue. But to not acknowledge that is the elephant in the room, right? and that is a problem. So, successful leader is going to create the environment that they want. In a crisis, that's exactly the same thing. If you're the crisis leader of your organization, you want people to be grounded. You want them to be comfortable as they can be in the situation. You want them to be aware. You want them to be all pulling in the same direction. Those are the things that we're looking for. You can help set that tone by making sure that people are showing up and being able to be in that way. What I always do is I always ask people, when you leave a room after running a meeting, how do you want people to feel? Do you want them to feel like that you were heard? That they understood that they contributed? That we're very clear about where we're going? What do you want them to feel? Because you know what? The way you run that meeting and the way you show up is going to be what happens. And that's really important. And I think I saw that over and over again during the course of the pandemic with our clients. So people often wonder, what does this mean? Am I born this way? So is it nature? Or do I have to, can I acquire some of these skills by nurture? And the actual is that some people have more emotional intelligence than others, but doesn't mean that you can't acquire these skills. It's really about you knowing how to access them and really talking about the issues we're talking about today. So how do you develop this emotional intelligence, which I will tell you, some of the best people I work on in our field have really strong emotional intelligence. And that sets them apart from somebody who doesn't. What they always say when you're in a plane and they're going through the safety drill, right? Put your mask on before you assist others. That's really what you need to be thinking about. It's important that we know how to take care of ourselves first, and then you can help other people. So you can't give what you don't have. So what are some things you can do to build some own personal awareness? So remember, going back to the top of our box, the self-awareness strategies. What are some of the strategies so you can just check in with yourself to see how you're feeling? So the idea is, stop and take a deep breath. Close your eyes just for a nanosecond. How am I feeling today right now? What's going on? Before I do a meeting, before I do an exercise, before I do a speech, the first thing I want to know is, okay, how am I doing? How am I feeling? Now, sometimes people will do kind of a scan of their body. They're going to kind of count to 10. The idea of getting up and moving, kind of checking out what's going on. Some people will write. The idea is really understanding where you are. Two of the suggestions my clients use all the time, I have one who loves this acronym called HALT. Ask yourself, are you hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Because if you're any of those things, it's going to get in the way. And another one loves this frame of, is this a 411 situation or a 911 situation? A 411 means I need more information. A 911 means, it's bad. So ways of just checking in with yourself is really important, and know what works best for you. Okay. Then once you know how you're doing, because you checked in and you found out how you're doing, then there are things that you should be thinking about under self-management. So, given how you feel, what kind of strategies might you use? This first bullet here, set an intention for every meeting. That's one of the most important things I think that every meeting should start with. Why are we here? In every book I've written, I talk about that extensively, and especially in exercise design. Why are we doing this? Now, I bet if most people seriously asked that at the beginning of a meeting, do you think that meeting would be necessary? Maybe not. Many of my clients have realized, oh my gosh, we just have meetings to meet. Why are we here? So, be super clear. Why are we here? The idea of taking a break. That's been hard for a lot of people in the pandemic. They have just worked themselves to death. The idea of, before you send that email, think twice before you hit that button, because you can't crawl it back, right? Making decisions just to make a decision, that's not helpful, right? So think about that. Rescheduling a meeting, don't have a meeting. Many of my clients have really questioned whether all the meetings they have actually provide any value. Some people have meetings to have meetings, and I have some clients who are in big financial institutions that have a pre-meeting before the meeting so that they're actually clear about what's going to happen. It's like, well, why have one? And then lastly, the idea of really giving grace to yourself and others. You know, some people have a great day, others not so much. And we're all not going to be on the same page all the time. And then the last thing about, again, this issue of social awareness and how you are relating with others. Really think about how you connect with people. Your mom always told you had to have good eye contact with people. That's really true. You've got to really look at people. And if you're going to ask somebody how they are, mean it. You know, there's a big difference when you say, how you doing? Versus, how are you? There's a big difference. So I know it's sort of a social construct that we have with each other, but really check in. Read the room, read the person. We all know that we have that skill. Use it, because it will make you and your other leaders much more successful. Listen, listen, and listen some more. If you don't know how to listen, get rid of your phone for a while. Just focus on what's around you. Two of my clients have some really great things they do after every meeting. The first one is that they do a one-word check-in around the table. Before the meeting starts, I just want to do a one-word check-in. I want to see how everybody's doing. Okay, go. And they just boom, 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 boom. Great. We all kind of have a sense of where we're all at. And then they'll often do something that is actually where they'll do a plus delta after every meeting. What worked? What needs improvement? The more that you're focused on that, then maybe you might realize you don't need to have as many meetings. There's other ways that you can actually accomplish things. But it's doing things a little more creatively and doing them differently. One of my clients actually is always working on trying to keep their emotional intelligence pretty high. And they'll always say, look, I'm working on my verbal skills here, or I'm working on listening, or I'm working on my eye contact. Can you guys rate me at this meeting? How did I do? And so they get direct feedback. So there's different ways that you can help improve your emotional intelligence. And I guess the whole thing behind this, I would say, is to be real. And I think that makes the biggest difference of all. So here we are. We are on a road. I wish I could tell you where the road's going. I have no idea. So I've been a pandemic planner for a long time, and everybody thinks the pandemic is over. It's not. And we are in this little sweet spot where there's not much transmission. Enjoy it. There are two things going on that are of grave concern to me personally. The biggest one is actually the war in Ukraine, not because of just all the awfulness, which is awful, but wars are the friend of infectious diseases. And there's a huge opportunity for the spread of variants. Ukraine was having a huge outbreak of COVID when the war started. They have less than 35% of their population vaccinated. They also are kind of vaccine hesitant in general, and they have one of the lowest rates of vaccine for children in measles and polio. So the concern about something happening just because of the war is huge. Then there's also BA2, which is a subvariant of the Omicron variant. And it actually is now pretty much ravaging China and Hong Kong and parts of Asia, Europe, Denmark, and the UK. So it's going to come here. It's already here, but I mean, the surge will occur probably in the next 4 weeks. Knock on wood, we have enough either vaccine presence in the community, or we have enough prior infections for immunity to build a wall, but we won't know. So we have no idea what's going to happen in our future, both with the pandemic, cybersecurity issues. The threats are really huge. The issue of a nuclear war, all of those things. So we are on this road together. And what I would say to all of us is that, we are instrumental in our companies about helping them recover and be resilient. But we need all of us to be standing at the end of the day. So I really ask all of you to really take what I've talked about today to heart, because you are important for your family, for your community, for your job, for your company, but you're only going to be able to do that if you're still standing. So I pray, I beg you to take care of yourself, to not burn yourself out, and to really think about the things that I've talked about here today. So going forward, trust is one of the most important things in leadership in times of uncertainty. And what we're looking for is the things that I've talked about here today. We're looking for compassion in our leaders. We're looking for a command structure and a process that's going to make crisis management work in your organization. We're going to talk about the issue and need to make sure that we are making and pivoting quickly and making corrections in real time and continue to do that. We're going to need to make sure that we are communicating in a timely manner. And lastly, we have to be caring for ourselves and for others. So on that note, if I have any time left, I'm happy to take questions. I'd also encourage you, if you don't follow me on LinkedIn, to follow me. I actually post a bunch of stuff which might make you nervous or helpful. I don't know which, but both of those. And on that note, if we have time for questions? Oh, great. Live display. Oh, good. I have to type it in. Sorry. Technology. I could just pace here for a while, get some steps in. Right, I'm going for a walk, yeah. Please. Say that again. Yep. The lessons I learned in doing pandemic planning is that what we did in all the pandemic plans that we wrote. So let me just say, I wrote for the 97 through 2009. When we had the 2009 pandemic, I completely revised everything because we had originally based it on the WHO standards, which wasn't going to be helpful at all locally because all diseases are local. So we changed the entire format of them. But then what I didn't have in my plans was, and what I now know, of course, after living this, is I didn't have enough. Back when I wrote them, and I still was imagining that we'd all have to be at work. So it never dawned on me that we would be home. So the plans were all written about securing places and all the things about making us being able to function in a workplace and not get sick, because it never dawned on me that we'd be home, because that wasn't possible until very recently. So that was the biggest learning. So now I haven't really gone back to revise all of our templates, but I will, based on that. How do you read a room when meetings are virtual? That's a great question. So the first thing that I do is I'll always do a check-in whenever I'm running a meeting, but I'll also be focused on what people are doing. Now that assumes their camera is on, right? So I have some clients who I've talked to for 2 years. I have never seen them because that's part of their mental health strategy, right, is they don't do camera. So that makes it really hard. So if I can't see them and check in with their eyeballs, then what I do is I'm just listening to their voice. And I can hear whether people are distracted or paying attention. And that's my only option, is that. But if they're not on camera, it's really tough. But I look into people's eyeballs. I really just check in. Way in the back. ProMed, so pro, P-R-O-M-E-D, mail, M-A-I-L.org. Harvard. Great question. Did I foresee that politics would have such a big issue in the pandemic? The answer is no. It never dawned on me that there would be leaders that, and not just here in the United States, but across the world, where they would not think that the pandemic was serious, not follow protocols, not encourage vaccines, not wear masks. Never dawned on me. So I totally missed the politics piece, and I completely missed the misinformation. I had no idea either one of those things would happen. And both of those have really set back the entire globe in the response on the pandemic, bar none. Those are the two biggest issues. Any other burning questions? Oh, thank you. What are ways that you've seen celebrate wins in the pandemic when we're not done yet? So lots of things that I've seen clients do to really try and celebrate the wins. So one of my big clients is one of the biggest banks in the world, and they have actually done a whole series of just really special little things for people. They're still all working remotely. So what they've done is they've actually done where on one day they closed the bank, and then that day everybody got a DoorDash certificate, and the idea was, okay, great, have lunch on us. You know, take the day off, take a mental health day, and here, by the way, have lunch on us. I've had clients who have deployed all kinds of different tools for mental health, both not only EAP services, but also things such as even apps for meditation and self-awareness, trying to help people to celebrate wins. The other thing, and I think the greatest thing this is kind of a weird way of celebrating a win, but most of my clients still expect people to work 9 to 5 or whatever the hours are, right? Well, a great way you can support your people is by doing asynchronous work. This is part of the big virtual migration that we're going to be going through over time. But asynchronous work means you have spoken with your manager. You work better, or because your kids are home, or whatever it is, you work better between the hours of 4 p.m. and midnight. Great. So if your manager says, okay, great, that works, that means that during the day, you are not checking your email. And it's okay with the boss because you are asynchronous working. That is a huge way you can celebrate your people by having a system that works for them. I badger my clients about this issue. Don't make them work all the time. Don't expect them to check email on the weekends. Give them a break. And if you can do asynchronous work, do it. But then don't expect people to be working when they're not supposed to be. What are some advice for returning to work for leaders? I have big fights with many CEOs on this topic right now because they want everybody back. Now, why? And this goes back to my why question. Why do you want them to come back? Because I want them in the office. Well, why do you want them in the office? Well, we have this real estate. Is that their problem that you have this real estate? Now, I have never in my professional career ever thought I'd be counseling people on opening an office or closing an office like this. But I think that we are in a point in our history where we are all permanently changed. There is no going back to what there was. Whatever it was is long gone. So I think the important thing that I would say to you is this, is that we need to think about why you go to an office. What do you do there? Can you be as productive at home? Is it critical for you to attend your office for certain functions? Totally. So a good example of that is Salesforce. They're a client of ours. They have a 107-story building in San Francisco. They opened on 2019. How's that working for them? They actually now, everybody has the option to be 100% hybrid. What do they use the 107-story building for? They've turned a lot of it that's still Salesforce property into collaborative space. So if you're having a big meeting, you want people to come together, great. Otherwise, for the most part, they are doing remote work and hybrid work. And so I think what it is that people really need to clearly understand, and this is the biggest thing I say to leaders, everybody has changed. You may not have changed, or you're thinking in an old way, but people are different, and you cannot stuff that genie back into the box. And that's the most important thing we all need to remember for us as well. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Regina. She will be outside in the lobby, so you guys can check in with her on her new book. And we will take a 10-minute break. We'll see you back at 9:15. Again, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and prepare for our general session 8. I'm going to be calling up Matt Bradley and Brian Zawada. So to give you guys a little bit of perspective on these two great people, Matt Bradley serves as Vice President of Global Security Solutions for OnSolve. In this role, Matt is a member of OnSolve's executive leadership team and works cross-functionally to drive the development of comprehensive and robust security operations solutions leveraging critical communications, risk intelligence, and incident management. Additionally, AV team, need some help here? Thank you. Matt is security operations expert he's been a security operations expert for the past 2 decades. He previously served as a regional security director for the Americas at International SOS. Prior to International SOS, he worked in Honduras as a security director for Tigo Honduras. And he's also been a general manager for iSolutions Security, where he advised on security matters for the Honduran president, Minister of Security, and Minister of National Emergency Commission. He's also had a 14-year career with the CIA. Brian Zawada, for those of you who don't know, he brings more than 25 years of experience managing and building world-class global resilience management programs to his role as Chief Strategy Officer for Castellan. Outside of his work with Castellan and its clients, he previously served as the head of the United States delegation to ISO Technical Committee 223, the author of ISO 22301, and he has contributed to ISO 22301 and led the project team that created ISO 22317. So ask him about all the ISO questions. In 2020, he published his first book, which I have a copy of, The Business Continuity Operating System. He's also a 2-time Lifetime Achievement Award winner from CIR and the BCI. So please welcome these two. They're going to be talking about achieving operational resilience in 2022, lessons from supply chain disruption and other dynamic risks.
Okay, now that we finished those lengthy introductions, we'll just head straight to Q&A. I'm sorry, we don't have time for that. We'll have to go straight to Q&A. When I heard from our marketing team that we had this session and I had the opportunity to pick somebody to speak with, I immediately thought of Brian, because this is my 4th DRJ. This is my first one in person. And when I first started here, the first person I heard talking about operational resilience was Brian. So I knew when we had this theme that Brian was a person that I wanted to partner with. So I'm glad, Brian, that you accepted, and look forward to hearing the insights that you have for our group today.
I'll look forward to it, Matt.
You want to talk about your book before we...
First of all, we failed to give all of them away at the booth yesterday, or over the last couple days. So there's a water cooler right over there, and there's 7 more. Don't run now, but if you want a copy of it, please don't make me have to bring those back to the office. So please grab one of those 7 before you leave, and hope you enjoy it.
And this is my first and only opportunity to be on the big stage, and my first in person, as I told you, DRJ. So I want to take a moment to recognize the fantastic people at DRJ and all the people here at Disney that have helped us put this on. Can we give a hand for them? Thank you. And I also want to recognize, well, Vanessa left, but I want to recognize her as our MC. If you've not connected with Vanessa on LinkedIn, I think that would be one of the most valuable connections that you could make, because if you find yourself in a crisis and you are not sure how to communicate, Vanessa would be the first person that I would reach out to. So if you haven't connected with her, go ahead. And she's done a great job as MC as well, so let's give her a hand. All right. Formalities out of the way, Brian, we're ready to get started. So we're talking about resilience. We're going to focus on supply chain a little bit later on and use some examples there just to give you another perspective on what we're talking about. So I'll get through our intro slides. And we did a Forrester survey, right? I like to start with some facts, some information from some relevant people. And these are professionals like you, as well as executives who have experienced crisis in the last couple of years. So we did a Forrester survey at the end of last year, and we surveyed more than 600 people, some in the business continuity, some executives. And we asked them how many of you experienced one event last year in the last 18 months one crisis event. And you can see there that 99% of organizations experienced one event. First question I had, Brian, was who was the 1%?
Yeah, who's the 1%?
Who didn't experience the pandemic, all right? So we wanted to reach out and talk to those people, but the survey was anonymous. Then we said who experienced two types of incidents. And you can see there that almost 3/4 experienced two types of incidents. And then the third was a third of the people had experienced more than, or 3 events or more. Okay, we didn't ask them if they were simultaneous, but if you experience more than one event, then obviously you were experiencing the pandemic while you were also experiencing something else. Okay, and that's a little bit of what we're going to start with, the definition of dynamic risk and the explanation of that. What are your thoughts on this, Brian?
Yeah, and the one thing I'd add here, and Matt said it, that what's not up here is how many organizations experience more than one at the same time, and not just experienced an event, but experienced one that was impactful to them. And I think just from my experience, put aside kind of the survey and the study type of approach, I get an opportunity all the time to talk to executives, and they're not as worried as much about a single event. But what they've talked about is the struggles they've had where they've had the same people involved in responding to a critical event and ultimately having to go ahead and respond to more than one at the same time. Same group, multiple events. How do they do it? What are the cheats, if you will, to being able to address that supply chain or other? And I know that's a good amount of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's what we talked about as well, the idea that these things come together. So let's get into some examples of this. First, we're going to start with the poll, and Brian and I are not sophisticated enough to figure out how we could do this for you in live, but that means you're going to have to stand up. So this is the audience participation phase of our program. Everyone stand up, please. Yes, everyone stand up. Everyone must participate in the poll. You can participate for as long or as little as you like, and you'll see how this works when I start to ask the questions. So sit down if the COVID-19 pandemic did not impact your organization. Okay, this is how we're going to take the poll. Sit down if you did not, all right? So everybody in this room, it looks like, is still standing, so they were impacted by that. Sit down if severe weather did not impact your organization last year. All right, a few people sat down, okay? But still, quite a majority that are still here. Sit down if civil unrest or protests or demonstrations did not impact your organization last year. All right, still quite a few people up. Sit down if a cyber attack did not impact you last year. Not just against yours, but did the Colonial Pipeline affect you? Did somebody else's, did JBS, somebody else's cyber attack impact you? Still a lot of people standing. And then, as all the people who talked about cyber attacks this year said, that you know of, right? Did you not experience a cyber attack that you know of? So sit down if you did not experience a supply chain disruption. Okay, still everybody's standing, right? And then finally, some type of staffing issue, whether it was retention, recruiting, or otherwise maintaining staff who were burning out as a result of this, right? So thank you all for participating. You can all sit down. So, Brian, what are your thoughts on this, on the number of events that even this group?
Yeah, this list was not chosen by accident. And what we, probably not surprising, but one of the things that we talk about lately is that, if we go back years and years ago, there used to be this tidal wave of, I'm going to build a strategy and a plan for every threat out there. And then that went away to something that was more all hazards focused. And then this new tool got introduced called, thinking about severe yet plausible scenarios. It was introduced by a regulator in Europe, and it's kind of taken over the financial services industry. And here's the interesting thing. These are the top 6 that we've modeled for many of our clients to be able to really understand readiness. And it wasn't just because they're the headline grabbers. These are the 6 that executives are asking their organizations all the time. Are we ready for these specific events? Show it to me. Have we practiced it? So on and so forth. Why is that? Because just like all of you, as you were kind of standing up and down there, these are things that have either affected organizations, sometimes at the same time, but they've also really had an impact on competitors and partners. And so again, this just goes to show that it's not just maybe one at a time, 2 at a time, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes they overlap. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, great takeaway from there. So let's get into talking about dynamic risk. And we're going to define the term that we call dynamic risk. It's not a term that you're unfamiliar with, you may be unfamiliar with the term, but you're certainly not unfamiliar with the concept of what a dynamic risk is. And it tells us that when I was responding to risk A, I got hit by risk B. So I was ready for one thing, but then something else happened, okay? And we'll give a few examples of that. Or I was expecting risk A, but then I got hit by risk B. So what you actually were preparing for was not the thing that happened to you, okay? And we'll use a few scenarios to talk about that. This was one that was, this came from a customer of ours who said, I was prepared for the hurricane that hit the Gulf Coast. This was Hurricane Ida. But what I wasn't prepared for was the flooding that happened in New York City a week later, right? And as Brian mentioned before, it was the same teams responding to both, right? So while you're in the middle of taking care of people who've been affected by a hurricane, you now have an office flooding in New York City that you weren't even prepared for, right? And I was in one of my earlier sessions where somebody said they lost a building due to the flooding in New York City.
Yeah, by just show of hands, how many of your organizations have a crisis management team or words similar to that? Okay, quite a few. How many of you, just by show of hands, have a team that is more, I'm going to call it conceptually oriented, that is saying, you know what, we're not looking at the next 2 to 72 hours. We're looking out 1 week, 1 month. We're looking at second order consequences. How many of you have one of those? You know, obviously far fewer hands. And what Matt's covering when he introduces dynamic risk is something that I've observed a growing number, granted it's still in its infancy, of something called almost like the plan ahead committee or the plan ahead team. The one that's looking at the second, third order consequences, or in this case, risk B. So we'll talk more about that as we go.
Yeah, and I'll tell a story about the chief worry officer from a company that, that we used an earlier presentation. So this is risk A becomes risk B, right? This was Hurricane Ida on the Gulf Coast that then became flooding in Manhattan, right? And I think the issue that I see when you talk about dynamic risk is that the plans that we have, even the ones that are set up in our systems when we're using a platform, that those plans are, let's run through the checklist when we're dealing with a hurricane, okay? And we're like, okay, well, everyone should evacuate and we're gonna close the office. And we're like, wait a minute, evacuate? What do we do when we hurricane evacuate? Oh, we put everybody in a large building right on top of each other and they stay there for a couple of days, which is great if you're not in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so that plan now isn't working. So the plans that we have are typically meant to work in isolation. How do you adapt your plan to work when there's a complication or a second risk that's affecting? Or how do you divert resources from one team to manage the other incident?
Yeah, and this is where I think you get into this whole idea of whether it's a separate team or it's a group of people that you add to an existing crisis or incident team, people that are wired for kind of that high conceptual skills to look at something and say, yeah, you know what, I get it, we're talking about a hurricane, but how can this get worse? Not only for myself, my suppliers, my customers. How does that impact the demand for our services? How does that impact the entirety of our end-to-end supply chain and ultimately the resources that we bring to bear to deliver our products and services? And so whether that's that team that I mentioned before or whether it's simply inserting a set of maybe tasks, procedures, triggers for something to really intentionally look at risk B, I think that's a key here, and I think this is a great example of that.
Yeah, we're going to go through a few more examples just to kind of drive home the concept. We're really painting the picture of what the problem is, and then we're going to talk a little bit later about the strategy and the framework around the solutions. So risk A causes risk B. You have a tornado that leads to power outages, and then a gas main break, and then that ultimately leads to an evacuation, right? So it's the follow-on effects. And we just had some very severe tornadoes in Texas and in Louisiana. And again, everyone is like, okay, there's a tornado. That's going to be a short event. Everybody get into the basement. Everybody get into storm shelter. Tornado passes. We start checking on people. And then we find out that they have other problems as a result of the tornado, right? And we had an example of a customer that had pilots who were and flight crew who weren't showing up for work. And they were like, why aren't these guys showing up for work? Well, they had been hit by tornadoes outside in their hometown. And so it wasn't that they had been damaged by the tornadoes, but now they didn't have gas and now they had to evacuate. And so that's where you're like, if you're not paying attention to what's going to be the outcome of this and how does it affect my business, even if you didn't know, why we didn't have an office. We didn't have an office that was hit by the tornado, but we had people who were impacted by that, and those people were the continuity that we needed to continue our operations.
And especially when we're talking about we're no longer having a concentration of people, we've actually allowed them to disperse. It just creates a bigger challenge.
2 thoughts on the work from home situation, right? You're like, okay, well, it spreads out our risk because now we don't have everybody concentrated in the large building where maybe a disgruntled employee or a disgruntled customer might have come and taken an action against us there. So we've spread our risk over more area, but at the same time, we've also increased the places that we need to take into account when things happen. So we've increased the number of places that we monitor. At the same time, we've spread out the risk. So risk A enables risk B. This is for you, Brian, to talk a little bit about how this works out.
Yeah, and we think there's the obvious. Many of you were still standing when we talked about civil unrest affecting your organizations. But and this is obviously a pretty obvious scenario that so many people have experienced both personally and professionally. But let's take something right out of the news over the last 4 weeks. Is that this type? When we talk about, and I don't want to call it a threat of social media, but it becomes a trigger where we all need to take action more. Is Russia invades Ukraine. Social media kicks up. It's not just a government sanctions effort now. It's now a personal sanctions effort. That upswell of protest against, in this case, by many of Russia, forcing organizations or at least influencing them to think, should I pull out of Russia? And then what are the implications there as well? And so you get into this dynamic of not just inside your geography, but a global upswell of protest that impacts how we serve our customers. How do we take care of our people, even though they might be in a place that might be considered undesirable? Some really interesting operational consequences. Again, not just what we've experienced over the last couple of years from a social perspective here in the States, but globally and the long-term implications there as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the one thing that you think about is, we saw the Russia-Ukraine conflict building over weeks and even a couple of months. And so, of course, people who had actual operations in Ukraine and Russia were taking mitigating steps along the way. But were you also thinking about the supply chain implications, right? And did you even know, right? We talk about the supply chain. It doesn't just extend to your suppliers. It extends to your suppliers. Those are also your suppliers. So key to understand all of that chain. And again, seeing okay, what opportunities do we have to be able to mitigate what might happen in Ukraine to our suppliers or the suppliers of our suppliers, not just our own employees. So again, the interconnectedness of all of this means we have to really be monitoring everything that's happening everywhere all the time. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can do that later on. So I think we have a couple more examples. I'll go through this one quickly. Risk B occurs for an unrelated reason, right? So again, you're dealing with, or you think that your major risk is a volcano, and it turns out to be militia activity. And my colleague, Chris Hurst, who we gave this presentation earlier, this is his story because he was a risk manager for a non-governmental organization. They went into a location in Congo, and they thought, our biggest risk is this volcano. And you're like, it's an active volcano, so it's a legitimate risk, and we need to be ready to move our people and our operations if that volcano should go off. But when they got there on the ground, the biggest risk they had was, soldiers coming over the border. And they're like, well, we didn't know that there was a civil war or a conflict going on at this time, right? So again, you're prepared for one thing and something else happens. So again, we got some statistics here, and this is where we're going to get into the supply chain piece of it. I'll cover the statistics, and then I'll let Brian talk about the implications on supply chain. So again, from our Forrester study, 22% of respondents said they currently track and monitor their supply chain risks. I would just ask a question here. How many of you are monitoring your supply chain risks? So maybe the similar percentage of people doing that. And only 41% of those had effectively optimized the response to that risk. So of those people who raised their hand that you're monitoring, how many of you think that you have an optimized risk management plan for that? Yeah, again, maybe a little less than that 41%. So what do you think about that, Brian?
Can you do me a favor? Go to the next slide for a second, and then we're going to come back to this one. I just want to this was a study that we sponsored at Castellon through our subsidiary BC Management, who does a lot of data studies, a lot of analytics. Similar numbers, a little bit higher in terms of only 52% of organizations address supply chain disruptions. 42 are really getting into more of the supply chain continuity resilience planning. You can go back to the other one. The reason I wanted to show both of them, when I first saw this, I thought, this really seems low. Now, it's really low compared to the other one, but the other one was still shocking to me too, that it was only about 50%. And the reason for that, at Castellon, we do two things, software and we have services. And about half of our services business involves kind of doing what all of you do. You're sitting in seats that involve running resilience programs. And I can tell you firsthand, because I have responsibility for the services business at our organization, I can't think of a single program we're involved that this is not number one or number two in terms of the issues that we're engaging with executive leaders on every single day. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've learned and our teams have learned as we've gone through this effort around supply chain. But when we think about all of the headline grabbers and all of the effects that people have had from a supply chain perspective, whether it was caused by COVID and a second order consequence causing by staffing, which led to a government action, which led to a port issue, which led to all of these other things that you're seeing up here. Let's take COVID aside. You have the severe weather issues. And, what was it? I guess it was early last year or at the end of the year before, the severe weather in southern Texas impacting the petrochemical industry led to plastics issues and the cascade impacts there. The bottom line is there's near constant threats. And when we talk about the complexity of supply chains and the fragility, if you will, of those supply chains, this is becoming something that is absolute top of mind of the sponsors of all of our programs. And again, if many of you are kind of in the audience going, you know what, I only really focus on the IT side of things. That's okay too, because guess what? IT, think about everything we're doing in the cloud and all of the service dependencies that involve third parties. Understanding kind of the end-to-end of how we deliver IT services is huge as well. And again, complex, fragile, something that we really absolutely do need to pay attention to.
How many of you are mitigating risks that you don't know about? Mitigating risks that you don't know about. All right, we only have one person here. The problem with mitigating risks you don't know about is you don't know what to mitigate, right? So it's kind of a rhetorical question. My point is, in looking at these numbers here of saying, how can you be mitigating supply chain risk, which Brian is saying people are talking about at the board level, how can you be mitigating that if you're not quantifying it, if you're not measuring it, if you're not monitoring it, right? And so if this is one of the biggest risks that we also hear from our customers that their board cares about, right? Now we're talking about business outcomes. What does the CFO care about? What does the CEO care about? He doesn't care what software you're using to manage risk. He doesn't care about how many people you have or don't have. What he cares about is, does the business continue to function? Do we keep making money? And if supply chain is one of the biggest concerns he has, and you're not monitoring that risk, you're not contributing, you're missing an opportunity to contribute to a business outcome, okay? And so if you're not monitoring, you obviously can't be mitigating, and that's the difficulty there. Did you have anything else you
No,
wanted to add
nothing
on
else
this
on
one?
that one.
Okay, so again, supply chain resilience, I think our point here is that it's important, and if you're not doing it, you should look to who is doing it in your organization or how you might do it. And we talked a lot about leadership, and I think one of the things that I've heard this week is about breaking down the silos, working cross-functionally, and we talked in our session about the Chief Resilience Officer, and really that wasn't about a title, although Vanessa has it, and I'm so glad to hear that somebody does. It wasn't just about having that title, but it was about you leading by influence and taking control of that position and being able to cross-functionally manage these issues. So that's where we're wanting to go. Raise this to the level that you're aware of it and that you start to work on it. So we're going to talk about frameworks. I'm going to go all the way through this?
Yeah, why don't you put the list up there. So I swear this is the last time I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. I apologize.
I cannot swear that I might not ask.
How many of you think that a key stakeholder in your program is the product manager in your organization? I invite you to change your thinking on that. Because one of the things that I've learned over especially the last 2 years, as we've had that introduction of multiple crises, is that the evolution of bringing supply chain or supply chain continuity, supply chain risk into the equation is the fact that it isn't just about the supplier, it's about you. And the person that knows the most about you, that knows this, you know, how the cake is baked, so to speak, in your organization, when you deliver a product and service, is the role of the product manager. It might be called different things in your organization, but the person that ultimately puts the pieces together and says, this is our go-to-market strategy in the organization, is the product manager. And one of the things that they really do very, very well is they're looking at the strategy. They're looking at, here's how we put the end-to-end. Here's where we meet the customer in terms of the delivery. They're oftentimes heavily focused on financial optimization. They're focusing on innovation of that product and service. But what's the thing that they don't focus quite a bit on? Is the resilience of that end-to-end. And so the second thing I'd bring up is the second bullet up there, is the idea of encouraging and engaging the product manager to identify substitutes. So I'll give you an example. One of my biggest clients, and one that I spend so much time with, is heavily focused on innovation of their product. They want to make sure that it's the best materials to survive the longest in the hands of the customer. They're a consumer products company. But one of the things that oftentimes when they're getting in and the product manager and the engineering team and the R&D team are getting together is they oftentimes are introducing something that's very, very difficult to source, very difficult to replace, but yet they're so focused on innovation. And one of the things we've encouraged them to do is take a balanced approach between innovation and what they're sourcing. Ultimately saying, you know what, if you insert this product, which is only found in one province all the way up in northern China, do you have a substitute for that product or that raw material, that input? And the same thing goes from an IT perspective. If we've gone ahead and introduced a specific technology and service, and that were to fail or prove to be inadequate, do we have a substitute to be able to deliver that service for the benefit of ourselves and our customers? So we oftentimes talk about manual workarounds and alternate processes at a macro level. The question is, do you have an ingredient that you could substitute in the delivery of your products and services? And this is the topic that we have a discussion on all the time with chief operating officers today is, you know what, I've got a supply chain problem, I have a sourcing problem. What's that thing that I could use instead of X so I don't impact the customer? And so what that really means is it's not just getting into being able to look at the continuity of the relationship with a supplier, it's being able to look at substitutes to make your organization's products and services more resilient. And so the idea of engaging the product manager, thinking about substitutes is absolutely key. Now, below that, of course, gets into a number of things that many organizations are doing today, somewhere in the organization, and maybe outside of your purview as business continuity, disaster recovery, resilience professionals, but they're still doing it. Number one, hey, we're taking a look at, geographic-wise and overlaying where our suppliers or what we need, where it's being sourced from to understand risk. We're looking at shortening supply chains. People have talked about insourcing, but actually bringing in region, not just in shortening those supply chains. Being able to monitor the resilience of suppliers. This is one of the things I hear about all the time is I'm hesitant to engage in supply chain continuity because I'm not sure I can do it very well because I can't see beyond the first supplier. It's not an insurmountable challenge with the data that's available to us today. And so being able to go ahead and really understand second, third, tier 2, 3, and 4, and so on is really something we need to daisy chain together to understand where we have single points of failure. A big one, as Matt said, we can't predict everything. We can't see every specific risk or threat out there. And so we need to have a really great response process. And a key ingredient of the response process is an early warning system. The data that helps us understand or gives us as much advance notice as possible when something bad's about to happen. And when we overlay an understanding of our supply chain with threat and risk intelligence, that's really where the magic happens. And so that's a key right there as well. And lastly, we oftentimes are sending out questionnaires to suppliers. I mean, so many people are doing that. But the problem is so many of those same people don't take action on it. They don't look at it and say, this answer, this information is just unacceptable to me. And it also it's on the critical path, it's a single point of failure, and it affects one of our most important products and services. How do we prioritize those issues, stay disciplined, and ultimately take action? I did a survey, I want to say it was in Q3 of last year, where we surveyed a series of boards and executive managers, and we asked them, what's the number one expectation you have for your business continuity resilience professionals? And you know what they said? We want you to be the conscience. We want you to be the reminding body when we're doing something that ultimately puts our organizations at risk. And this is all a big part of that, is building the situational awareness and really reminding the organization we need to take action in a prioritized manner.
Thank you, Brian. I think that's a great framework. The only thing I would add to that is that one of the things that I think has come out of the last couple of years of just continued crisis, starting with the pandemic, but then adding to all those other things that we talked about, is the rise in creativity in solving problems, right? So your supply chain problem solution used to always be, well, let's just find an alternate supplier because there's plenty of people out there who want our business, and if you don't give it to me, I'll get it from somebody else. But how many people, I won't make you raise your hand, but how many people here are waiting on a Ford Bronco, right? Yeah, a couple people waiting on a Ford Bronco, anybody waiting on a truck or something else that requires a chip, right? And so we know that there's a shortage of chips, and there's a couple of things that Brian mentioned that we could do to solve that problem. One would be buy those chips from someone else, okay? But turns out that those someone else's, they don't have any chips either. Well, what are people looking to do now? So now the automakers are saying, well, I'm going to bring it home, right? I'm going to build a factory to create my own chips, so then I won't have to worry about that problem ever again. I'll just build my own chips. And then you're like, okay, well, that sounds like a good idea, but how long is it going to take to build a factory that produces chips of the quality that you need? And so what's the short-term answer? Well, how many chips do we actually need in a truck? Why don't we redesign the truck so that we don't need as many chips, or we get rid of the chips that are causing the problem, right? And that might be a shorter-term answer to the problem. So think of the creativity, right? It's
well,
not about...
You baited me about this whole Bronco.
I didn't know that Brian was waiting on a Bronco.
My Bronco's not showing up because of the chip. You know what it really is? I ordered it because I had one of those hard tops on it. And you know what they said? You know what happened there? The supplier that provides Ford with the hard tops was affected from they thought at first a staffing issue. Turns out it wasn't that at all. That supplier was buying the equipment to build those hard tops for Ford, and that supplier had a pandemic staffing issue in Germany. That's it. They got plenty of chips. So guess what did Ford do? They offered me, we'll give you a conversion kit. We'll give you a soft top
and then
to eventually do it. And it turns out that too many people wanted that and took advantage of it, and I was too late to the game. Right. But
so think of the creativity,
that's an example of creativity. That's my point,
yeah.
Is that substitutes in creativity, and it turned out it served them well, possibly to a fault, and certainly to my fault.
Well, and think about the monitoring of the supplier, right? So you're thinking this guy's going to put together the hard tops for you, and he's not getting the raw material that he needs. If Ford had known that that person also had an issue, then maybe they make the offer sooner, maybe they make the conversion quicker, maybe they get a better messaging out there, and you don't have thousands of people that have paid for Broncos waiting for Broncos, right? But what I want to focus on is the creativity of saying there isn't just one solution to all of these supply chain problems, and it's about incorporating as many of these solutions as you can. So we're going to outline, our framework around people, processes, and technology. And the good thing about this, I already gave a presentation for those that I saw, our friends that were in my presentation. This one's going to be a little bit different because we're going to talk specifically about how it applies to supply chain. But I've heard a lot about people this week. I've heard a lot about processes, of course, and a lot about technology. So we're going to walk that through from the supply chain side. And for me, of course, we know that our own people, our employees, are our number one asset, and we've been working to take care of them over the last 2 years while they've been displaced or moving in and out of the office. And so that is kind of a given, I think, at this point, that our people are our most important asset and we're taking care of them. When we talk about people in supply chain, it goes back to what Brian said about how far into the chain do you want to be able to manage, right? So the people that you're concerned about are not just your own people who are putting the top on the Bronco, but the people who are building the top and the people who are supplying the raw materials for the top, okay? And so those are the people that you need to take into account, and because of the risks that they might be affected by, you have to monitor a whole bunch of things in a whole bunch of places all the time. And you're like, that sounds like an overwhelming task. Well, that's kind of what it's meant to be, right? It's meant to be a little bit of an overwhelming task because no single person is supposed to do it. And I think that's the key thing of saying, if you're talking about staffing issues with burnout and other things, it's not your job to do everything, right? Many of us have already come to that conclusion, but we're going to talk about how you can leverage that.
Yeah, and I think if I was to summarize what Matt said, it's all about creating culture of continuity throughout the organization. And again, as I said before, in this case, culture of, and you can kind of put a blank and fill it in, and I'd say supply chain continuity. And in this case, it goes back so far. It goes back into R&D, engineering, product management, enforcing the conversation or maybe facilitating the conversation around the concept of substitutes.
So if we know that we have people that we have to protect and monitor, we need a process for doing that. So we put a few processes up here, and I don't know, Brian, maybe you might recognize one of these processes because you created it. So
yeah, and that's the point is there's many, many different ways to do this. And again, I'm not going to sit there and say that there's one that is supremely better than the other or that you shouldn't borrow from different processes and solutions and frameworks. But I think the most important thing here is if I was to talk about characteristics, and the middle one is from the Business Continuity Operating System that we introduced at Castellon. But the most important thing here is running it intentionally, running risk as a business, and obviously prioritizing. Not the chicken little, sky's falling, we got to solve every possible risk, but being able to really work through this thing over time. Introducing an intentional process that executives and even people throughout the organization that are involved in being able to be part of that end-to-end, that go-to-market strategy can really buy into. And so again, we're not going to go through all the details here, but the point here is find one that works, run it intentionally, and ultimately don't be afraid to borrow from different sources to be able to do something really good for your organization.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm an engineer, so I love process, and we're not going to have the time to go through all the different things of the process. But the number one thing for me on the process side is it must be executable. And I go back to my experience at the government. I was in Honduras, and there was a coup. So the ambassador calls us in, and he said, look, there's a coup, there's some civil unrest. We might need to evacuate the families and maybe even eventually the embassy staff. And so I need everybody to go back and review the embassy's emergency action plan and get ready to execute it. So I went back to my office and I said to the admin person, I said, where's our emergency action plan? And what do you think she brought out to me? She brought out a giant 3-ring binder, right? 5 inches thick. And she said, well, here's our emergency action plan. I said, there's no way that we can execute that. In fact, we probably won't be able to even find the section on evacuation due to civil unrest before we need to evacuate. And so the plan was not executable, okay? So if any of you have software that would work with the government, I'm pretty sure the government is still using 3-ring binders for emergency action plans in the embassy, so there might be an opportunity there for you. But it was not executable. So we had to go back and say, here's the plan in a single page that we can execute in the moment. So my big thing is you pick whatever process works best for your organization, but make sure that it's executable. And how do you know if it's executable? Because you test it, right? If you haven't tested your process, then it may be working well in the situation that you're in, but it might not work when you actually have the crisis where you need it to work. Yeah. And then finally, what it all comes down to, right? I mean, I think we've been painting unnecessarily so, or not unnecessarily, but without meaning, we've painted kind of a grim picture here, right? We've said there's a lot of problems in the world, and you've got to monitor not just your employees, but your suppliers down to the very end of the chain. And we've said you can't do it, and you've got multiple risks going on as well. And so how do we do that, right? It comes back to technology, and the piece that I like to talk about on technology, and then I want you to talk about the rest, is the digital transformation. Right? We hear about the digital transformation. You can't read an article in the Wall Street Journal or McKinsey or anywhere else without hearing about digital transformation. What does it mean in general, and what does it mean for your organization? What it means to me, because I was like, we keep saying this thing, but what do we do with it? It means to me that you're leveraging technology to increase efficiency and productivity, right? That's the purpose of introducing the technology, is to make you more efficient and really to do more than a single person can do. And so, whether that comes to monitoring thousands of locations at one time for dozens of different risks that could occur with multiple severity levels that could affect your particular assets, and then notifying you in a timely manner so you could take action. I used to produce intelligence with analysts. It is slow and it is difficult and you miss things. Okay, the only way to catch everything, or most everything, is leveraging technology. And I think that's my point, is the digital transformation for me in business continuity is about how can the technology be the force multiplier.
Yeah, and how do you organize that complex end-to-end from the what's supplied all the way to the customer, overlay risk and threat intelligence information to give you that early warning system like we talked about before. That's how I'd summarize it.
Yeah, and then know what to do with it when you get it, right? You know, I mean, again, no good knowing about something if you don't then know what to do with it. So I think we're getting down to our final thoughts, and then we'll take some questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, and if I was to summarize this, number one, hopefully, you know, we talked about that plan ahead. We've talked about substitutes, increasing the stakeholders to help, you know, solve some of these issues. And when it comes to supply chain, it's not just your procurement group, it's your product management team as well. But do so, taking action and helping to kind of be the discipline in your organization to take action in a prioritized manner. Run this effort like a business. Borrow from the frameworks that make sense for you and your organization. And ultimately, create the culture of continuity, be intentional with process, take advantage of technology to overcome the complexity that is your organization.
Thanks, Brian. My final thought on this, and this statistic that's up here really is just to encourage you to say that, you know, there are things out there that can help you. So this is again from our Forrester survey. It talks about critical event management, but you can think about it from business continuity or disaster recovery or organizational operational resilience to crisis management, is that those that optimize the capabilities that they had, that optimize the technology, produced a better outcome. Okay, and you can think about optimization of your process, you can think about optimization of your people. The better you optimize, the better result that you're going to have. So, you know, what I would encourage you is to look at the people, the process, the technology, see where you're lacking, what gaps you have in capabilities, how can you leverage technology to help with that, close those gaps, and then optimize what you have, right? It's not always about introducing new technology so much as it is optimizing what you have before you go get something new. So we do actually have a question.
This is probably one for you, Matt.
Is it? All right. What avenues or service providers are the major players used for early warning situational awareness of conditions in global geographic areas? Thank you, Mike, for the question. So some people call it threat intelligence. We call it risk intelligence. What it is about is monitoring physical events that can affect your physical assets. Your physical assets can be your people, your buildings, your suppliers, your providers, your warehouses, your customers even in some cases. So anything that you can put on a map. The reason why you need to be able to put it on a map is because there are thousands of things happening all the time. The ones that you care about are the ones that are affecting your assets. And so I mentioned this in my earlier presentation. Whenever you hear of anything that's happened, a critical event or some other incident, you always ask yourself, am I a participant or a spectator? And you're a participant if you have assets that are affected and you need to do something. You are a spectator if you don't have any assets in play. So the first thing is knowing. And there are lots of different people to do it. OnSolve has risk intelligence. There are other providers out there. What you need to think about is, how can I get the information quickly? How can I provide the coverage that I need to cover all of these locations around the world? And how can I correlate it to my assets? Okay, so think about that when you're evaluating these systems. We use AI and machine learning because it's the fastest way to collect thousands of pieces of information and make them relevant to you. So think about how that technology speeds it up for you. And I'd be happy to go into further discussions about other providers out there. This one is for you on the strategic side.
Yeah, what's the easiest avenue to approach senior management for buy-in? I think it's making it real. I think there's probably 16 seconds left. Two things. Number one is make it relevant based on, if I have a risk, I got to tie it back to the customer and the products and services the customer consumes. And that's the language of the executive. It's ultimately products and services, customer connection. The other thing is to make it real. I mentioned plausible scenarios before. Again, I'm not advocating threat-based planning, but executives, they look at headlines just like all of us. And if we can talk about events that have been that either was a near miss for us, it was something related to a customer, a supplier, or a competitor, If we can say, how are we prepared for that? Where are we vulnerable to disruption if that was to affect us? And what have we done in terms of practicing and testing? Again, real events make it real for executives. So those would be the angles that I'd take.
Great.
All right, well, I guess we are out of time now at this point.
Are we?
Are we?
Well, we got
Or
a
do
little,
we have another?
We got a little extra time,
Oh,
but
okay,
do
I
we
didn't
have
know
any?
well,
Here we go. Have you seen cultural change adopting OpRes since the pandemic?
yes. Yeah, and again, this is not just a regulatory angle on this, but I think it is very much a cultural piece. You know, again, natural disasters have been out there for a long time. The threat of cyber, it's been out there for a long time. But when we're starting to see multiple things happen, things that weren't just something that lasted for just a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, but a pandemic plus something else, and where we're seeing horror stories as a result of some of these threats, the idea of being really good at responding, yes, that's still important. But if I ask 10 executives, tell me what's more important. Is it preventing the disruption or is it being good at responding? The answer 10 out of 10 times is yes. I want both. Okay. But so many of us are focusing on being able to be really good at responding, building plans, documents to be able to go ahead and demonstrate that we have a strategy to recover. But the reality is that the executive leaders in our organizations are saying, where are we vulnerable to disruption through single points of failure or a lack of substitutes? And what have we done about that? What are we doing about that? And prove it to me, because their number one need is confidence. And so when we talk about operational resilience, it's very much prepare and respond. It's about closing vulnerabilities in a prioritized way, but being supremely good at responding because you can't predict everything, as Matt talked about.
And the thing I would say about culture, so we've talked a lot this week about culture and culture of resiliency. And the thing that I want to make sure people understand is that culture of resiliency is not the same culture for every organization. Okay, it's not about saying, here's the culture of resiliency, book by Brian or anybody else, go and apply it at your organization. It's about taking your organization's culture and making it resilient, okay, so that its culture can continue even in the face of crisis. So you have to adapt yourself. I don't think any of us are going to be successful, walking into a company and saying, hey, we need you to change your culture to this culture of resiliency, right? They've spent years and years building their corporate culture. Now, spend a few months or years making that culture resilient. We have another question here, and it says, and this is a great classic risk manager business continuity question. Never let a good crisis go to waste. How do we capture the opportunities presented to our profession from the pandemic?
Yeah, and I think this is a classic example of engagement. I mean, I'd say the organizations that are most mature have been doing almost in crisis postmortems to kind of bring input from a lot of different people. I mean, I think most people that have written a pandemic plan prior to COVID-19 learned a lot, to say the least. And whether it's most people were focused on percent absenteeism over 3 waves and what happens if I lost all my people. And the reality is that it's an important consideration. But the thing that I think was interesting as an example was, well, what if it's not about me? It's just really the behavior and expectations of my customer has changed. And did we ever consider that in a pre-COVID-19 pandemic? That's an example of an opportunity, and that's one that's being echoed over and over again by product managers. But there's an infinite number of data points and expectation shifts that have taken place from different stakeholders. And it really comes down to engagement, grabbing those, figuring out how it can move the needle from a business perspective, prioritize those, and work through those with your different stakeholders over time. Solicit input from leadership to see what's most important to them, and then be able to take action.
And the number one thing I've heard from customers over many, many years, even pre-pandemic, was, I'm doing all of this good work and nobody knows. Okay, well, post-pandemic, if you're still doing a whole bunch of good work and nobody knows, you may have missed the opportunity to take advantage of the opportunity, okay? But what I'm guessing is you did not miss the opportunity, and your position or your function or your activities have been elevated in the minds of your organization and the stakeholders. And that is the real opportunity, right? The real opportunity is to demonstrate the results that you have delivered in the past couple of years and your ability to continue to deliver those results in the world that we live in now. So here's another question. What processes do you see being used to prioritize assets? Beyond monitoring of critical assets, is there automation available to notify proper actions to mitigate the threat being realized? And I think that's about the technology that you employ, right? There is obviously technology that can help you monitor thousands of assets, by a prioritization of those assets, and tell you what's happening to those assets at any moment, and then notify you, activating a plan saying, here's a hurricane that's coming this way. This is the hurricane plan for this location in the Gulf, right? So not only is technology about telling you something that has happened, it's about orchestration and automation of the activities that you should undertake whenever something happens. And that's important, again, when there are multiple risks affecting you at the same time. You want to be able to automate or at least orchestrate those things so that you have a consistent response over time to the same types of incidents.
Yeah, and there's, when I think of, I'll cover the first sentence of this question. What processes do you see being used to prioritize assets? I'll cover that first. Again, when Vanessa introduced me, she talked about ISO, and I gave her way too many numbers, and I apologize for that. But ultimately, those standards all have said for many years the idea of products and services, and I've said it a million times already today too. And if we use that at the top down and work all our way down into all the ingredients to bake the cake, being able, whether you use a business impact analysis, whether you use automated discovery to mine your organization to put together ultimately what I call the digital model of the organization. The thing that is all the data from what do I need, the ingredients, who supplies it, all of the internal assets, the processes to transform them, the delivery channels to the customer. And if we think of that end to end, that's a lot of data and a lot of complexity. There's a lot of ways to do it. You can automate the data collection. You can go ahead and run processes for a BIA. But doing it top down for products and services is absolutely essential, because it's there that you can go ahead and A, see the single points of failure, B, see where you lack substitutes, and C, overlay the risk intelligence to give you that early warning system. And so, again, to me, there's many different ways to be able to do it. When I think of a business impact analysis in today's environment, it isn't as much about estimating the impact as much as it's being able to build that digital model, being able to really collect the ingredients, line them up, and be ready to understand the vulnerabilities in case something happens, so you mine that information to say, so what? What's everything to the right of something that's been disrupted, to understand who's been impacted.
All right, great. Another question here. How do you deal with the organization that now feels it's invisible as it survived COVID?
Yeah,
Invincible, maybe. They've said invisible, but maybe they mean invincible.
I think it's invincible.
They might think they're both.
It could be. But when I think of this situation, I mean, for forever, and it's not just about COVID, how many times have we heard or experienced a leadership team that said, we're all a bunch of smart people. If something bad happens, we'll figure it out, right? I mean, that whether it's COVID or not, it really doesn't matter. The question is that ultimately what I found to be useful is, I kind of mentioned, a couple different tools to make it real and concrete. In so many ways, COVID hasn't had a material impact on many organizations. It's the second and third order consequences. And the question becomes is that many people did in fact navigate them pretty well. But at the same time, could you have navigated them better? And ultimately quantifying the potential business benefits if you could have done that. Again, this is not a COVID situation. This is more of a cyber situation. But I was with a company the other day. We were talking about their e-commerce capability, which is 19% of their business, going to 40% of their business in the next 18 months. And we looked at this and they said, you know what? We're really good. We're able to go ahead and be able to go ahead and recover no matter what, because we got a lot of great people, a lot of redundancy. We can do worst case scenario in about 81 minutes. Okay, fine. Today you're at 8 billion and you're about to go to 20 in the next 18 months. If you could shave off even 40 minutes of that 81 minutes, what's the business benefit? Pretty huge. So anytime you can quantify for an executive audience, it's great. But it's not a question of did I survive, but could I have survived better? And I think sometimes using plausible scenarios makes it real for people and said, you know what? We did pretty well. Are we ready for this? This person wasn't. Should we do something about it? and having some meaningful business discussions, I think, is important. If in fact, however, you still have somebody that doesn't pay attention, my recommendation would go find another job. There's plenty of them out there.
Yeah. And I don't think the goal was to survive COVID, right? The goal wasn't to survive because there were many companies that thrived during COVID. So the other part is when we don't have a lot of discussions that are centered around COVID right now because we're so far into it. And anytime we start a discussion with somebody, we always ask them, what are the top 2 or 3 events that affect you, right? So it's not just about, we know dynamic risk is coming. So it's not just about, did you do great during COVID? Because if you did great during COVID, but you fell over on the tornado, that's not good, okay? And so we talk about more things than that. So it does look like we've run out of questions and we've run out of time. So on my part, thanks, Brian, for agreeing to present. Thank you all for your participation, your engagement, and for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, with that, we will take a 15-minute break, and our next panel will start, actually it'll be like 18-minute break, and our next panel will start at 10:30. All right, welcome back. Let's get a round of applause. We got some energy in here. We have stayed the course. We've got flights today and tomorrow. I'm excited. So this is our last session. After this, I have a group of students at Savannah State University that are expecting me to teach them something at 3 o'clock. So I will have to head out on our flight. But before we leave, I want to have a opportunity to introduce our panel for our final general session today. My colleagues, James Green, John Liuzzi, and Margaret Mills will be hosting and helping me in this town hall panel titled Resiliency Transformed. What we're going to be talking about today is really a summary of the last few days of this conference, the discussions, and the things that you guys can go back and take back to your programs. So, hi. Welcome.
Hello.
This is not a presentation. This is not a presentation. This is a conversation. We just so happen to have microphones. So what we want is to hear from the audience. For those of you who may have attended the virtual DRJ town halls during the pandemic, they were lively, they were full of discussion, and a lot of that conversation was contributed from the audience. So we planted a few seeds. We hope you guys ask some questions. If you go into the app and you click on this last general session and type in the questions that you have, we want to see those. If you can help me out, because I might not look behind me to be able to see the questions. The AV team, if you want to post the questions on this front monitor here, that would be helpful. But this conversation is for you. It's a conversation. It's a discussion. So just want to make sure that's very, very clear. And with that, I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with James.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. My name is James Green. I am one of the co-founders of the Resilience think tank. I'm also a co-founder of Illuminate Advisory. I'll do one little pitch. We just launched a new website 2 days ago. So if you guys could hit that and crash it, I'm sure my marketing team would love that. This chair, I feel like I need a smoking jacket and a pipe with this chair. This is a little uncomfortable for me.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Liuzzi. I'm the National Director of Business Continuity for Southern Glazers Wine and Spirits. And if I have a pitch for you, just keep drinking. I mean, that's pretty much what we do, and it keeps us in business. And we appreciate all of your support. So thank you for attending today.
Hi, everyone, and I'm Margaret Mills, and I run the Global Resiliency Center of Competency for Kyndryl. And I feel obligated to say, who is Kyndryl? Well, who is familiar with IBM, BCRS at IBM? We are now known as Kyndryl. We've gone from blue to orange.
Awesome. Well, go ahead.
Nope, IBM spun off Kyndryl back in fourth quarter of last year. So look for the new name, new logo, and see us in the audience.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. So once again, for the AV team, if there are questions from the live screen, we can take them from this screen here. I have all my notes up here. Thanks so much, guys. All right. So there's a few things we've heard through this week, and I don't know about you guys, but here's the 4 things that we took away. Brand and reputation management came up a lot during this week's conference. People, whether it be succession planning, whether it be diversity and inclusion, or whether it be the Great Resignation, people was a constant theme. Implementing controls for cybersecurity, and of course, the supply chain. So what we're gonna do is we're kind of gonna work backwards. We're gonna start where Brian and Matt started, and we're gonna work backwards and talk through the last couple of days. So starting with the supply chain, and John, I'll start with you if that's okay. When I look at the supply chain, I see 3 components: raw materials, manufacturing, and then distribution. Where is your focus on those 3 areas of the supply chain?
Well, supply chain is everything for us because we're a distribution company, right? So we have to make sure the logistics of the products to be able to make sure that we can bring those things to market. So we have, and supply chain continuity is nothing new for Southern Glazers. They've been doing it since the day that they opened their doors. So they have a very robust logistics team associated with just managing, bringing products. Well, we import from over 40 countries throughout the world. So there's always something in play associated with demand associated with all of our products from all the world. So all of the different, you name it, the transportation routes, the distribution, the network, all of those things are part of our day-to-day operations, and our team is very, very proactive associated with making sure that we can continue to service our customers. From a business continuity perspective, we provide a lot of situational intelligence about the information that we get about the threats that are that are ongoing throughout the world, and stuff that happens in the far corners of the world, affects our products because they come from all these different places throughout the world. Like, did the Suez Canal impact us? Absolutely. I mean, all those things are part of what, from a business continuity perspective, we just continue to provide that situational awareness. So when it comes down to certain products, there's only one place you can get Dom Perignon, all right? So as a result, what we have to do is be very, very proactive about with the suppliers and associated with that with our markets to be able to make sure that our sales force, which we manage as well for all of our products, are understanding exactly what the supply chain is, what the expectations are, what products we can deliver. And to one of Brian's points earlier was about what's the alternatives potentially. And certain products don't have an alternative, to be honest with you. But we try to do our best that we can to make sure that our suppliers have the appropriate products that they have. It's a day-to-day thing, but we do it really, really well associated with supply chain management.
So Margaret or James, so as you think about those three aspects of the supply chain, what questions or what conversations are you having with your clients on those things?
What we're finding comes up with our clients is, first of all, diversification. As he just mentioned, there are some raw materials that you can only get from one place. But there are many things, and what we saw in COVID, especially, everybody laughs about paper supplies and toilet paper, but if you were only set up with one vendor or two vendors, then you put yourself at risk. So like anything where risk is involved, diversification is a key part of making sure that you do not interrupt your supply chain. And I think the second piece is really having good communications and plans and programs in place between you and your suppliers, so that you are having a shared expectation of what happens when supply is interrupted and how you intend to respond.
The biggest thing I've seen with our manufacturing clients, there's a huge difference in philosophy if a company is public or private. Public companies that we work with, it's prior to pandemic and prior to everything going sideways, very focused on just in time, very focused on how little raw material can I carry, and a lot of companies still have that philosophy and they're getting burned on it. The private manufacturing clients we have they don't care how much inventory they're carrying right now because they want to be able to meet the needs of their client. I was on site with a company a few weeks ago. They have one really bizarre special raw material that generates 40% of their revenue. They're carrying 15 years stock of that right now so that the world can end and they can still supply. Unfortunately, it's not Dom Perignon, which is critical in our household. But private companies have that flexibility where we're just going to carry. We're going to have huge carrying costs. We're going to have inventory levels that are ridiculously high, and we're not going to get punished for it.
Again, if there's any questions that are coming from the audience from a supply chain perspective, please feel free to ask them. So I think most organizations in this room probably are coming from different parts of your level of maturity in the supply chain. So what's the three-step action plan from maybe a immature structure to those that I have a process, I have situational intelligence, and they're at your, capacity, John? What steps do you think people can take?
Well, I think that they, for us, the whole part of the entire process is just understanding our demand planning. What's the demand associated with the products that we have, right? And being very proactive about that and scheduling things and providing, 6 months or a year in advance associated with our sales and projections on a customer demand. So that's something that, again, our company is very mature in being able to do that and be able to predict right now. They're predicting all the demand that's going to happen now for Christmas. So being very much ahead, being very much make sure that the supply chain can now meet those demands. And to James's point about just stockpiling that stuff so that we do have inventory available to meet all of our demands. So demand planning is a big part of what we do. And again, it's just that intelligence, that situational awareness associated with what is actually happening. And then also for us, as far as like the transportation leg of any type of supply chain, is having alternative suppliers so that they can, if one carrier can't bring the product, then we can switch it to another carrier, that type of thing. So it's, we use every transportation mode available and every route possible in order to make sure that we can get the right product to the market.
James, any comments on your steps and action?
No, I have a question for John. How were you predicting demand in early 2020 when everyone was buying alcohol at record rates. Like I feel like the demand was exponential in real time.
You know, so just so everybody's aware, so in the year 2020, when the first year of the pandemic, we had a slight bump in revenue. And Southern Glazers, just so you're aware, every single year that they've been in business, made more money than the previous year. It's a remarkable, it's a machine essentially is what it is, right? So, so 2020 was just a slight bump, right? But and consider the fact that restaurants closed, hotels closed, all the closures where people typically go for social events, where beverages are served, all of those things closed, and yet we still saw an increase in revenue. One of the things that was interesting about it is that people found their spirits, but they also upgraded their spirits. So now instead of me going out and having the top shelf martini at my local bar, I bought the Grey Goose and did it at home. So there was an interesting consumer trend associated with what happened associated with in 2020. And then in 2021, everybody was just excited to get out, and guess what? We had another banner year. But to the point is that, you know, we've had so many years of track record associated with the sales that we understand where the peaks and the demands are. Like certain days, certain holidays, like, okay, St. Patrick's Day, 4th of July, Memorial Day, you can almost predict where your demand is going to be associated with that, with your peaks.
So that brings us to a great point. In 2020, we were all at home, and I just recently saw on the news that a Fortune 500 banking CEO is requiring every single one of their employees to come back to work. And in my millennial brain, I was like, your workforce is going to quit, like all of them. So Margaret, I'll start with you. So the return to work has created many challenges and opportunities. I think we've seen some great things. I think we reevaluated how we work. How are you seeing companies handling this return to work?
What I see is frankly a level of sensitivity. What happened when the Great Resignation really became into the corporate consciousness at the senior level is a renewed focus on how people practice work-life balance, how they take care of their families, and improving the sensitivity in how they respond. There's been several very well-known case studies of where companies did not respond with a level of sensitivity. And I was talking to one of my peers earlier in the week. We were talking about the phrase that many of you may have heard is, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And so what I'm seeing personally is this level of focus on, I want to know more about you as an employee. What's your family life? How far away do you live and work? And then as a result of that, see more flexibility based on people's individual situations and not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely.
So Vanessa, I've been managing COVID for Southern Glazers. Today is day 750. So I am right in the middle of it, right? So the way that we've approached it, and obviously we had a number of employees that can go work, back office employees that can obviously work from home, but you can only distribute in warehouse. You need people in a physical building, right? So those folks didn't have the luxury of working from home, right? The way that we've approached this is that we are bringing folks back into the office and reassessing and getting everybody reacquainted with everybody, and then we will institute a permanent company policy. Because right now, the policy that was developed under COVID really wasn't a policy. It was really an emergency management situation when you think about it. So what we have now done in our HR team is now gone back and researched it and put the appropriate protocols, disciplines around exactly what a remote workforce would look like. And now we're going to institute that policy. Once we kind of reinstitute everybody back, the relationships back, the face-to-face is back, and then understand how we would execute successfully work program.
So I'm going to talk about the complete opposite of everything we just heard. So for everyone in the room, who here worked in a company 2019 or earlier where you had to be in the office every single day? And you don't have to raise your hands on the next part, but think about at that company, was it a good company culture? And so what I'm seeing with a lot of companies is that those companies that had the butts and seats mentality, you have to be in your seat 8 to 5, the rigidity, they are really struggling now. We've seen a lot of organizations talk about, well, if people aren't in the office, we'll go out of business. And what's happened the last 3 years? People haven't been in the office. Those companies haven't gone out of business. And now, you didn't want to mention them by name, but I'll say it, Jamie Dimon, who is a very powerful individual in the financial services firm, is mandating all of his employees come back into the office. He has the luxury of taking a helicopter from his house to the office every day. So his commute is fantastic. And I think those companies with that rigidity are really struggling. Anytime you're on polarizing ends, you always have to be in the office. And I'm not talking about essential personnel or, like John said, we can't distill alcohol in our house. Well, I mean, I'm in Florida, so I probably can, but most of us, that's illegal. But if you always have to be in the office or you never have to be in the office, if you're on those polarizing ends, you are losing employees right now. Every one of us in this room, we have our company name on our badge. You can change that tomorrow. You no longer have to sell your house or pull your kids out of school or figure out who's going to walk your dog. You have that ability to change. So I'm seeing companies who are mandating a return to work, not for safety reasons, not for collaboration, not for productivity, but just that's how we've always done it. Those companies are really struggling right now.
Vanessa, one more thing, okay, so what's really important to understand is that, for our program, we have an incredible amount of executive support. I mean, that is not a problem for my organization, right? But what makes that work is being there, being present, and that's from a business continuity perspective. So when you look at the remote workforce, you have to understand from the perspective of business continuity, that's an on-premise job. It really is. So everybody kind of needs to understand that. The fact that I can be face-to-face and be in presence, that helps me get more executive support to help me build my program. So that's a key differentiator when you talk about remote working. For us to be very, very successful, it's about presence.
So I agree with that. I was talking to a managing partner of a consulting practice. His career started, he was an entry-level analyst, but because he sat outside of the door of the executive and whenever he had a problem, he was there, had visibility. So that kind of brings me to my next question before we answer the next audience question is a seat at the table. So it's come up a lot. Talk about buy-in and engagement and leadership support. And John, that's something that you have. So I often say people don't pay to come to a conference to know what, because you know the what, that's why you paid to get here. It's the how, right? How do I specifically, take these steps? So you can get a seat at the table, but then you have to stay at the table. So my question for you, John, is if you can go back to when you started your program, how did you get the seat at the table?
First thing was establishing what the agenda for the program was going to be and making sure everybody understood and clear what the objectives of the program were going to be. And the other thing is you have to be a better business person than you do be a business continuity person.
Can you say that again?
So you need to understand the metrics of your business, the seasonality of your business. That will get you a seat at the table. Okay, you don't have any rights to get there just because you have a title of business continuity. So what? The idea is that in order for me to get that executive level of engagement, I need to understand the business. And as long as I do that, guess what? I'm invited to every single meeting, and I have an opinion, and I have a voice at every opinion. Because why? I'm looking at it from a risk manager, from a continuity perspective. So now I have huge value associated with the fact that all those metrics that they're trying to meet, guess what? I can help them meet those objectives. So you want to make sure that you plug yourself in, you become a business expert. And that's hard, but that is really what the measure of success for our program has been.
And then how did
How do you keep the seat?
keep the seat?
You have to keep, it's every single day. It's not just about, as the business changes, you have to be in a focus. I mean, and the idea is that they know that they can trust you. The fact that you understand the holistic part of the business, so you're now involved in the change management process and all the acquisitions and all the other things that transpire. Day one of COVID, like I said, 750 days later, guess what? My boss said to me, John, this is yours. You take it and you run with it. This is a business continuity issue. So you manage it. You tell me what you need. Right now, this company works for you. So, and that was pretty powerful for him to be able to say that. But it's like, wow, I got there. We have that responsibility. So, and that just came with overall just building all the relationships and helping everybody understand all the risks associated with that, and keeping them involved. Well, when things happen out in the marketplace, how would that impact us? There was a great example that Brian talked about a few minutes ago. Is like, hey, when stuff happens out in the marketplace, it doesn't have to happen to us. Like Walmart had that huge fire last week, unfortunately, right? Guess what? We operate facilities of the same size. That could have been us at any point in time. So I went to my leadership team and said, hey, what would we do if this happened? Keeping them engaged associated with what your job is, risk management, with overall situational awareness, is really important for executive engagement. Don't just wait for stuff to happen to you. Make sure that you take events that are occurring to other people and bring those to the attention. What would we do in that situation?
So, Margaret, as a woman, first of all, I have enjoyed all the women. So thank you, ladies, for all of the conversations. Thank you. It is great to be represented. So when I think about a seat at the table, it was do guns, play golf, travel the world, talk about sports, drink beer. A fourth of those things I don't even care about. So can you talk about your path to establishing your seat at the table and how you got there, and for people to respect your voice, so you could where you are today?
Yeah, and all four of those things are being seen as, you know, on the inside, part of the team, part of the club. And like you, I don't play golf. I'm not going to go out and drink beer or throw darts, or that's not my thing either. And I came up through this business. I started as a mainframe systems programmer back like in the early 80s. So I came from a technology point of view, and I had to go up and speak to the board of directors of my company. They didn't know what mainframe was. They didn't know what DASD was. They didn't know what IPL meant. All the lingo, all the way I was used to talking. And the words that I used to be part of the club, you know, among the mainframe systems programmers, which were still a group of men at that time, that lingo, that language, that way of being in relationship didn't work for me, for anyone, frankly. So it just doesn't. So what I had to learn, and it was a long, slow, difficult process, is that I had to learn to think like them, so that as I spoke, I didn't speak about what I wanted. Here's your IT risk. Here's your business continuity risk. I had to think about what they wanted. What are the business objectives that they have in their business? I had to be able to speak in terms of risk to the business. And one of the mistakes I made early in my career is I went up talking about the risk of a tornado to their data center, and a single data center. And to me, that was a really legitimate risk. And the gentleman on the other side of the table, he said, I agree with everything you're saying, but right now we're in a situation, a competitive situation, where we're fighting for our survival competitively in the marketplace. Our products are out of date. We are losing market share. We are getting attrition of our customer base. He said, so when I compare the risk that you're speaking of to this other risk, you know, I'm having a hard time seeing your point of view. And it was like a light bulb going off for me that I had to understand what risk meant from his point of view. And John, I see you shaking your head.
That's right.
So when John says you have to learn to speak like a business person, I had to learn to think about his job is on the line. What are his goals that he has to accomplish every single day? And I had to learn that I had to be relevant, I had to be timely, I had to be progressive, I had to focus on where he sees the ball moving, and I had to always be able to bring actionable recommendations based on what his business problems were, not what I saw my job as.
Yeah, every time,
true.
my entire career has always been about sitting on the other side of the table. Not about me, about the other side of the table. What do they want to hear from me? What value can I bring to them? That's what you have to focus on, not your agenda, their agenda.
So any thoughts for you?
Yeah, no, I love that. Your CEO does not care about a fire in the break room. So if you're talking about a tornado or a fire in the break room or your BIAs, your CEO, one, will probably tune you out, and two, you won't have that audience.
My CEO cares about the tornado.
Fair enough.
Because what was I doing last night? Making sure that the employees that lived in the New Orleans area were okay. And unfortunately, one of them lost their home.
But to your point, I think that goes back to, John, why you are honestly an anomaly in our business, where you have executive support, you have resources, you have tools, you have a lot of things that other programs don't and will not, because you connect with your executives. They do care.
All right. So thank you for that. So we have a panelist or a audience question. We started off this week with Raven Solomon talking about diversity and inclusion. And the question is, what do you see as the value to our profession specifically? So who wants to take the first?
Nice, easy question. We have a lot of questions coming in. I love talking about this topic. I also work for myself, so the only one who can fire me now is my cat. So I'll answer this. There's a lot of value. We need diversity of thought and opinion in our profession to grow, to thrive, to be relevant. When you have, just as an example, when you have a panel and all 4 people have the exact same thought and they all say the exact same thing, that's not an interesting panel. That diversity of race, of sex, of cultural background brings diversity of thought, brings a diversity of ideas. And I think it's, just from a selfish perspective, I'm very passionate about our profession. I love our profession. Our profession right now, the general makeup of our profession does not match the general makeup of our population. And anytime you have that, there's no succession planning there. That does not look well for an industry to sustain itself long term.
I would also add that anyone in the role of crisis management or business continuity has a people element. DR is often technology driven, and if you orchestrate or automate, you really are pulling people out of the equation. But anything in strategy or design or crisis management involves people. So not only is the diversity of thought and opinion so important, as James mentioned, but when push comes to shove and your company is having a crisis, you want every single individual within that company to feel a sense of loyalty, of responsibility, and integrity to making sure that they do the right thing to recover. So getting everyone from every layer involved and feeling invested in the company and being responsible collectively for continuity and crisis management could make the difference between whether your company survives or not. There's a very old joke in the DR world that says the best disaster recovery plan is a copy of your resume offsite. How many of you have heard that joke?
Yeah.
Funny.
Right? And it's a cute joke, but the underlying message is that, if we have a disaster, I'm just going to grab my resume and go. That's the last thing that you want.
Yep.
You want people to feel that the company cares about them and going to do, as John said, to protect them and to be there for them if their house is affected or their home or their family. And you want them to feel the same way about you. And diversity and inclusion, and recognizing that at the core of every business are humans doing the best they can is core to making that happen.
Yeah, so managing COVID, right? We have such a diversity of all of our employees, from top-level executives all the way down to drivers that deliver boxes every single day, right? And everything in between. So we had to make sure that as we put all of our policies and procedures in place, protocols in place, that how they address the individual specific needs of different ethnic groups, of different socioeconomic groups and things like that. So it was really important that we understood our economic, our profile associated with all of our demographics, all of our people, so that we put the right policies in place so they were able to impact everybody and be fair to everybody as well.
Absolutely. So when I think about a seat at the table, as a woman of color and specifically a Black female, it's access to the table. So in my career, I had to know someone at the table to be invited. And the ability for you to strategically develop key relationships and know how to build them and sustain them over time in rooms where you are underrepresented or do not exist at all is a task in and of itself. So my question is, and also here at this conference, there have been so many people that said, I would love to speak, how do I do it? Well, I'm not the MC that thinks that I should be the only person of color on this stage. I have a seat at the table. How do we help to make sure that the people who want to speak, or if you have things about your program that you want to share, sign up, be a speaker, tell your story. Who can you partner with to get on a stage so that your voice can be heard? A question that I asked you guys when we started was, who gave you a microphone and who were you giving a microphone to? And I think we all have a duty and an obligation to do that. But before we go back to the supply chain, because I also want to talk about cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, I want to talk a little bit about access to opportunity, which is what Raven spoke about in her talk on inclusive leadership. So I'll ask you, James, as a member of the EAB board with DRJ, what are your thoughts on the actions that we must take in this industry to catch up? She mentioned we were 30 years behind from starting this conversation. What are those actions that need to happen?
Yeah, I think access to opportunity is a huge one. Look at who's been on the main stage of this conference and other conferences the last few years. And people see us sitting on the main stage, but don't see, you know, the first 3 years in this industry. I applied to speak, I got rejected. No one wanted to hear what I had to say. My first session was the classic, like Sunday, 6 a.m., 2 people in the audience, vendor sponsored. You start with your local, your ACP chapter, you start with your small organizations. To Vanessa's point, I partnered with a high-level executive at a vendor because who was I? I was just some guy. And then I think where we need to be stronger with the people who are on this stage, the people like this, you need to be reaching out and opening doors for people who aren't yet here. I want to see more diversity of thought at this conference, at all conferences. I loved that Raven spoke at DRJ. I want to see more keynote speakers and general session speakers that are thought-provoking, that are provocative. It made me sad to see people walk out here, frankly, on Monday. We should be open to being challenged in our ideas and our mores and the things that we think. And so we need, the more experiences, more different points of view we have in our community as speakers, the stronger we are as a profession. And that starts with those small speaking engagements, 5 people in the room, 7 in the morning, like, oh my God, why did I commit to doing this? And we need to partner with people. And those of us who are speaking need to partner more with people who want to speak. I've spoken to several people this week who are like, oh, I wish I could speak. Apply, submit, partner with someone who has experience doing this.
Any other thoughts?
Anybody wants to partner with me in a speaking engagement, let me know.
There you go.
There you
LinkedIn.
Come on,
It's
that's
a
a voice.
wine and a speaking
We're good.
engagement from John.
We're good. All right. We'll figure out what we're going to talk about later, but bring it on. Come on. Anybody wants to stay on the stage with me, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Yep.
There you go.
So what are some things that, so John, you talked about some of your policies and the steps that you guys took in COVID to recognize that we've got a very diverse group of people. What were some of those things that maybe you saw the organization do or do differently to help you see and acknowledge and better support those diverse people?
Well, I mean, we just made accessibility to certain groups in our organization. Like, we provided vaccination programs on site because we knew some of our folks would have challenges to be able to go to CVS or Walgreens and get vaccinated. So we said we brought it to them, and we tried to address the different diversity of our employees and what their needs were, as well as their willingness and our incredible thankfulness that they showed up for work every single day, right? So we tried to, reach them, as well as make opportunities for their families as well. They can come in and get vaccinated, those type of things, or even just get tested. We provided test kits to our employees as well, and it was a tremendous expense logistically for the company to be able to do that, but that was the right thing for us to do. And in order to meet the sensitivity of what families were going through during those times, as well as what we were trying to do, is trying to keep the business running. But at the end of the day, Southern Glazers is all about, tell me about the employees. Like last night, John, what's happening with the employees? That's a key part of it. No matter who you are as an employee in Southern Glazer, everybody's always at the same level.
So just in the 3 to 4 days that we've been at DRJ, there's been crisis all over the world, and specifically here in Orlando. And so when we talk about people and the role of diversity, James, is there anything that you might want to share about some of the things that we've seen here locally?
Yeah, I think what we're missing as a profession, and a lot of companies are missing, things are happening in real time that it's a term I call brand corrosion. So I don't know if everyone noticed yesterday, at points in the day yesterday, there was less staff on site than there were on Monday. So Disney, there was a large contingent of Disney employees that staged a walkout here at all Disney properties, at all Disney locations yesterday. And I think we need to be mindful of things that are happening in real time where we're located. You have a high percentage of employees at Disney in this case that are so upset with some of their company policy regarding who they sponsor politically that they walked out. That is a huge, I mean, that's huge to me. Think about what it would take for you to walk out of where you work. Like, that's not like, oh, they ran out of coffee in the break room, or we don't have donuts today, it's not Taco Tuesday. Those are significant. Those are the things that are corroding companies' brands, and why it's so important to me as a business continuity professional. One of our goals is to protect the long-term viability of our business. And if our brands are being corroded, that negatively affects the long-term viability of our business. So we've seen, just in the last 3 days, we've seen a walkout at Disney. John's dealing with tornadoes. There are things happening all the time in real time, whether they're natural disasters, whether they're tactical, whether they're political, that I think we need to be more in tune to and more sensitive to, because they are affecting the organizations that we work for and support.
So one of the issues that we had to deal with in addition to COVID was the civil unrest. Not only did it impact our customers in some way, right? It also impacted our employees. So kudos to our CEO who decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to get in front of this and I'm going to create a video. I'm going to send it out to everybody. We sent it to every single employee on mass notifications. Everybody got this message CEO sent out talking about all his position and the company's position on all of those social issues that were brought up. And he got such an incredible amount of kudos for the fact that he stood up right in front of it, rested for everybody. So those are the type of leadership, Regina talked about leadership. That's like an incredible leadership, to be able to get right in front of the issue, in front of your employees in real time.
Well, I think the other part that's key there is that your CEO did it himself. That was key, because we had clients where, well, I need my person in Corp Comms to write it. Like, if you can't think about people and human life for yourself and for the people who work for you and express the words on your own, personally, I have an issue with that. Like, you should be able to help me understand how you feel about this, and so your people know that you care and that they are valued. And I think that's kudos to your CEO.
Absolutely, and I think it's so obvious. We've all worked for companies where you've gotten an email or a video from the CEO and you know right away that was written for that person. They're just reading right off the screen. You're like, you don't
Are you reading word for word?
Yeah, so that kind of authentic leadership in being genuine and caring about things always comes across.
It goes back to what we said about having a seat at the table. I want to have a seat at the table, and I want to hear my voice heard by the CEO. But I want the CEO to have a seat at my table. I want to know my kitchen table, right? And the table, the conference room table that me and my coworkers are sitting at. And that requires that they also are able to see things from my point of view. They get to walk a mile in my shoes. There's a phrase in the emotional intelligence community that says, when in doubt, focus out, which means, what is that other person thinking about, feeling about? How are they responding to the situation at hand? So it's a two-way street. And I think that both James and John's just did an eloquent job of speaking into examples of that.
Absolutely. So I would like to go through a few more questions and also just reserve time for just, Q&A, because we really want to hear from you all. I'm going to go into critical infrastructure. So we mentioned this a lot throughout this conference, and when I think about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, they started with critical infrastructure, and 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector in the United States. So my question is, what concerns, and John, I'll start with you if it's okay, because every business in here depends on critical infrastructure. So what concerns do you foresee for the U.S. critical infrastructure as it relates specifically to cybersecurity?
Well, we haven't done enough to protect it, to be quite frank, which I'm still trying to understand why the power grid is accessible through the internet. I mean, if it's that critical of an infrastructure, why is it publicly accessible? Hello, right? I mean, there's certain things that are associated with the way that the infrastructure is protected. It just doesn't make sense. The other thing, okay, so I'm a former government employee. Okay, I was a 3-time congressional appointee, right? And one of the programs I built for the IRS was the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program in conjunction with Homeland Security, right? So it's not only about, you know, the government saying, hey, we got to protect the critical infrastructure, but now you have all these, the 85% of private industry that have to run it, but they don't have the funding to support it to the appropriate level. So you can just say it and put out all these standards and things like that, but you're not giving them any funding or any additional support in order for them to actually do those things. So as a result, guess what happens? Those vulnerabilities stay in place, and as a result, they're not, those vulnerabilities are still there, because why? We don't give those folks that are running that infrastructure enough of their resources to be able to do the appropriate amount of protection for it.
24 hours before Russia fired the first bomb, launched the assault into Ukraine, all of the Ukrainian government websites and financial websites were taken down by Russian hackers. Think about that, 24 hours before. When we saw that in the news, I knew that within the next 24 hours that you're going to see a physical, demonstrable assault on the ground. 48 hours after that, you saw all the hackers that were non-Russian oriented start to launch a cyber attack inside of Russia. You saw it happening. We are watching about wave 5 or 6. So the second wave was the Ukrainian side launching cyber attacks into Russia. That was followed by then a third wave of the attackers or people in the cyber world starting to take sides. And then you saw this launch and counter launch. And then what happened was governments and businesses started taking sides. Everybody from McDonald's pulling out to governments. And then you saw another wave of cyber attack against the corporations that were taking sides. And I don't think we're done with this game. It's going to continue, because what has become crystal clear through all of this is that cyber is now a critical part of warfare.
Yeah, absolutely.
So raise your hand if you're in the process of planning a cyber exercise. All right. Raise your hand if the timeline that she just walked through is a part of your scenario. Right?
Exactly.
Like, she just gave us a whole plan.
Exactly.
James, so what are your thoughts?
So a pet peeve of mine that I'll share, because we're all family now. If anyone who's seen a cyber or ransomware discussion at DRJ or in the last 3 weeks, have you seen a picture of a hacker as a dude in a hoodie? Hackers are not white guys in their mom's basement in a hoodie. Like Margaret talked about, these are state-sponsored threat actors. And the concern I have with 85% of our critical infrastructure being private, my company cannot outspend or defend against the spending of the Chinese government, the North Korean government, the Russian government. Pick a government. We're going to lose every single time. And I think we really need to get away from this idea that a hacker is a lone wolf, just, you know, surfing the dark web, scary term, in the middle of the night. These are state-sponsored rings of threat actors who will overcome most of your cybersecurity because they have more people, they have more resources. And as Margaret mentioned, these things were happening before a physical invasion. These are now an aspect of warfare that we need to be prepared for, and we need to be thinking of threat actors in different ways.
How many of you guys work in what's considered to be critical infrastructure? Okay, all right. So I think about financial services, healthcare, energy, water, sewer,
Alcohol
roads.
distribution.
Okay.
That's critical infrastructure, I'm not going to lie.
And now
Roads.
apparently toilet paper.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
toilet paper,
Really?
chicken.
Look, food, roads, bridges, dams, the things that we drive on, transportation. What do you think is the worst that could happen in a cyber attack? Everything shut down overnight?
Yeah, so someone in the audience said everything shut down overnight. You would have civil unrest at levels that we've never seen. If a power grid went
If you lost the
down,
power grid, you'd,
If you lost the power grid or it's not just a bank, but if you created distrust in the financial ecosystem,
yeah.
you would cause a run on the bank. And it would not matter whether it was a physical attack from a hurricane to a cyber attack. If you create the sense that you cannot trust the financial infrastructure of this company, it shut any company, any
Great.
capitalist company down, country down.
Well, you bring up a great point. The tornadoes are still going to happen if there's no power grid. So it's not like we're just dealing with one thing. It's going to be several things. So then I guess here's my question. So let's just play the scenario out. If the worst case scenario happens, what people hate that we do, right? What is our role in business continuity crisis management?
I think it's the same as it always is: prevention, preparedness,
But it's
and
already happened,
response.
right? Like I can't prevent the grid from going down. So once it's down,
But I can prepare, right? And I can do things within reason to make sure that I have diversification. I can make sure that there are people and processes and capabilities staged to be able to respond as rapidly as possible. And I'll give you a good example of Walmart in a hurricane. So if a hurricane is coming up the coast, most companies are trying to get out. The big retailers, like Walmart, are doing the exact opposite. When they know that it's coming, they are pre-staging trucks with everything from generators to water to diapers, right? That's a preparation thing. I can't stop a hurricane, but I can respond to it in the best way that I can within the reasons and the capabilities and the money, as James said, that I have at my disposal.
yeah. So for those of you who are listening online, the comment was made that if communications and lines go down, the world will come to a stop. So since we got about 11 minutes left, John, I'm going to kick this question to you from the audience. For suppliers, how do you address timing concerns to shift to an alternate supplier? Some could take weeks or months to fully engage.
yeah, I mean, it could take weeks or months. I completely agree. Yeah,
That's
I mean,
true.
it depends upon what the product is. It depends upon what the timeline associated with the delivery of that product, from manufacturing all the way to a warehouse to distribution. So yeah, sometimes it can take weeks or months depending upon what the product is. But again, like our demand planning team is trying to anticipate that potential impact, and therefore making sure that we have appropriate amount of stockpile on site so that we can address customer demand.
In the IT world, there's a concept called RTO, recovery time objective. And I know what that objective is, and then I back into the IT configuration and capability that I need to make sure that I can meet my RTOs, right? So if I have a 72-hour recovery time objective, I might be able to get by with cold site and tape. But as recovery objectives started to shrink over time, I had to make business decisions and as a consultant with every single client that I meet with, what's the cost of downtime and what is the cost of the alternatives to maintain my RTOs? Same is true in the suppliers. You're making business decisions, John, about is it worth spending money pre-disaster, pre-event, to pre-stage to meet my supply and demand requirements. And sometimes that decision is, yes, it's worthwhile to spend the money for your Dom Perignon. That might be a worthwhile, yes, I want to spend the money and build that ahead of time. And in other cases, you may say, no, I'm willing to take the risk and I'm willing to put up with the longer recovery time. So it becomes a dollars versus time trade-off.
It's funny because our demand planning people, they do business continuity all day long. They just don't know it.
Right. Right.
On your fan clubs on,
You know?
on
Yeah.
screen.
It's just,
John, we
Thank you
truly
for that.
appreciate your supply chain resiliency the most.
okay.
As we take in more questions from the audience, whether you want to raise your hand or ask it, go ahead. Tim, I think is your name. Yep. What would you like to ask as our question?
I think it's a great approach to lose employees, is what I think that is. So if
We appreciate that.
a
But is it-
company's bottom line has improved,
Yeah.
why wouldn't you do more of that? The
Yeah,
goal
that's
of
the
most
data.
organizations is,
Yeah, that's the business.
Well,
Yeah, you want to read the question?
so the questioners around, the gentleman in the audience said that at the start of COVID, they sent everyone home to work and revenue and productivity has increased. And now the company wants to force everyone to come back into the office and what our thoughts were on that. And my response was, you're going to lose employees. So a for-profit company is in the business of making money. If you're making money, you should keep doing what you do to make money.
Yeah. So Erica on YouTube Live said, going back to Margaret's point, the company also has to understand its minimum business continuity objective. What is an acceptable operational level during a disaster and staff to prepare accordingly? Just have another question in. How do we keep our eyes on all risks compared to those that just seem to be at the top of the news? Margaret, you want to?
Yeah, all risk is a tricky word because you could be focusing on something that is so minimal. And I'll use an example. When I will do risk assessments with clients, I often do not include a nuclear attack in my list of risk. And they'll say, why do you not include nuclear attack? I say, because at that point, you don't have a big risk. You have no risk because you don't exist anymore. Your country may not exist. The world as you know it may not exist. That's not a big risk. That might be a no risk, depending on the company and of course, the global span of the company. So I think to keep your eye on all risk is a misnomer. You have to understand what are the types of risks. You get savvy about saying what are the types of things that could impact my company. For example, John is worried about supply chain risk. As a outsourcing provider and as a consulting firm, that's, as my company, is less of a risk for me. So focusing on supply chain risk may not matter to me. And then secondly, I would say that there are many, many tools and things out there. I do worry about weather risk and civil unrest risk because I have employees all over the world that are servicing our customers. So those are the types of things that could disrupt my business.
Yeah, I think if you're a practitioner in the audience and you're a party of one, team of one, we've all been there, and you have no tools and you have no resources and you're a single point of failure and your organization is asking you to monitor the entire globe in real time, you're going to fail. It's an unrealistic expectation. To Margaret's point, we can't monitor all risk. We want to be able to monitor and assess a lot of risk. And if your organization, if your company's not supporting you and your program, it's not going to happen.
So our organization, we have a number of automated state-of-the-art tools that provide me with risk management. So we have over 200 locations nationwide. So not only is my role business continuity, but also crisis management and emergency management. So I need to know if something occurred at a particular location or within proximity of our location, right? So specifically, we manage it all from a risk perspective. We have all the situational intelligence tool And there's a lot of information that comes in, but we have it so that it is fine-tuned associated with that, and it takes time to get there to find that sweet spot. But guess what? The most relevant stuff shows up on my phone. It weeds out all the kind of the noise, right? But the most relevant stuff that, hey, John, you need to pay attention to this, shows up on my phone, and therefore it's much more actionable. And the fact that we do that gives us such incredible executive support and credibility.
So, question for each of you, and you can only give me a one-word response or a one-phrase response. What is the number one thing that you believe, walk out of this room and fly out of Orlando, for those of us who don't live here, what should we be paying attention to?
From a risk perspective?
From your perspective.
Cyber risks are the number one thing. No question.
My phrase is be relevant. It's always changing. Today it's cyber. Tomorrow it might be something else. Stay on top of and be progressive about what's coming up.
I don't follow the rules, so I'm going to give you a lot more than one word. John mentioned earlier that we're in day 750 of COVID, which means as business continuity and resilience professionals, we're in day 750 of incident response. Prior to COVID, who in the room or in the audience had managed an incident longer than 10 days? There's about 5% of the room. What I'm really want you to think about right now is the mental health of our colleagues. I got a text today from one of our colleagues said, "I'm really not in a good place," and I don't think any of us are in a good place right now. And I want everyone here to know it's okay to talk about that. We're not built, we're not wired to manage a 750-day response. So I want everyone to be, it's okay to reach out, it's okay to ask for help, it's okay to know we're all struggling. We're all suffering in some ways. So my two-word response, and very long, would be mental health. What I want people walking out of here thinking about.
So when you look at the 750 days, the concept that we have in our program is it takes a village. This business continuity takes a village for all of us, right? So if you're the only one managing your program at that single point of failure, like James talks about, yeah, you're having issues right now. But I don't have that issue. Why? Because I got a whole village of stakeholders that are bearing the load with me as well. And they're all point people. So I'm the quarterback, but essentially I can throw the ball or hand off the ball to any one of my teammates or anyone in the organization, whether that's communications, HR, operations, whoever that is, or part of that COVID incident response teams. And that's what makes it all work, and that's what makes it very, very successful.
I would agree on the mental health component, because we have to put on our own life mask or our own mask first. I was on a panel a couple weeks ago, and one of my cousins, I received a text right before I was supposed to start speaking. And my cousin was just deployed to Kosovo. And I'm an only child. My mom is a daughter of 9. My dad's a son of 5. So I got a whole lot of cousins and a whole lot of aunties. And so my cousins are like my brothers and my sisters. And it brought me to tears to think about a war. And I've seen just people in our country say, well, you can't even spell Ukraine. Well, that's a problem. But why are we concerned about things that are happening there? It's not happening here. It is happening here. You just don't think about it from that lens yet. But my family is deployed. I don't know when they're coming back. I don't know what that's going to turn into. And I started crying before I went live, and I had to get myself together. But also the ability for me to say, you know what? I got tears, and they're about to come out. So the conference organizer gave me my space and allowed me to do what I needed to do to get myself together. But I do feel like there's been another level of authenticity that I hope continues to maintain, that we've seen in COVID. It needs to maintain. We were all caring. We were all concerned. There's new things happening in our world, and I want to make sure that we maintain that sense of care. We will take this last question from the audience. With the polarized world we live in, how should we address protecting our employees from things like workplace violence, political unrest, et cetera?
Oh, that's a nice
That's a
softball
really
question.
great
to round
question.
out. Oh my gosh, shoot, and they did it anonymous too. That's dirty. I want to call somebody out right now. You know, I think John had a good example. How you address protecting your employees is, do you actually care about your employees? And that's not a rhetorical question. Times of stress and disasters, what I've seen during COVID, has really amplified companies' cultures. So companies that had good cultures, like Southern, that's been amplified. And companies that have bad cultures, that's also been amplified. So I think the biggest way you protect your employees is to genuinely actually care about your employees. And if you're at an employee that an organization doesn't care for you, it is a hot job market right now. Find a company that does care about you.
Well, for us, I mean, it's about situational awareness. Again, making, if there's stuff that is going to happen or in the news, whatever that is, keeping our employees aware of it prior to being very proactive with information so that they can prepare themselves for it. In that vein, then it's about, okay, training. What do you do during an active shooter situation? What are the actual steps that you should do to keep yourself safe, right? Training them to be able to do that. Okay, we had to train our drivers that were driving into areas potentially in inner cities during the civil unrest time. Exactly what do you do if you were faced with a situation where you felt threatened? So all of those things, just that education thing, because you're trying to make them feel more comfortable about doing their job. And the fact is, we're showing them that we're caring about them.
So I'll add to that. I do believe that we have to show employees that we care. I believe that corporate is at a crossroads. And you are either going to adapt to acknowledge your role in everything from social justice matters to the level of risk that we have in the organization, or not. And I also believe that I totally understand there's this conversation of, well, we shouldn't talk about politics. Well, politics creates a whole lot of risk. And politics is also a reason for a whole lot of disinformation, which is why your crisis communications plan may not be effective, because what politics enables. And so I do not believe that it is realistic to think that we're not going to be able to mix in the conversation about politics. You can't vote or not, your corporations can't make donations for certain campaigns and then refuse to speak up about things that affect the very people that you're donating to. Like, that's just a conflict of interest. And so I think we're at a place where what's been normal and what we've grown up to believe as common business practices, I think it's all being challenged. And I think that there's a lot on the table that people are not thinking about, that you're going to have to say something. And if you don't, as the data showed from the first presentation on Monday, your employees will feel it, your bottom line will experience it, your stakeholders, your suppliers. And so I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. So with that, we're going to close. If you want to come up and talk to the panelists, we will have that here. Thank you so much for attending DRJ, our 66th conference. So safe travels, everyone. Thank you to the DRJ team. Thank you to the team in the back with AV. We support you. See you guys soon. Great job, guys.